Hello, world. We are thrilled to welcome you today to the kickoff of the Climate Change AI Summer School 2023. My name is Olivia, and with me today is Amanda, the support TA. I would be your lead TA. So we would like to acknowledge and thank you the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR, Mila Quebec AI Institute, Worldsphere.ai, and Volkswagen Group of America for sponsoring this summer school. But let me tell you a little bit first about Climate Change AI, which is a volunteer initiative to catalyze impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning. You can learn more about our initiative through our website at www.climatechange.ai. You can follow us on Twitter at climatechangeai. You can join, if you haven't done so, to our community platform, and you can subscribe to a newsletter. Today, I would like to have a big kudos and a big love sent to the summer school organizing committee. Amanda, Daniel, Harry, Jay, Jeremy, Maria, Melanie, Millie, Priya, and a special thank you to Eric for taking this initiative with such a big passion. And of course, I would like to thank you to all the teaching staff of all the amazing invited lecturers, tutorial authors, teaching assistants, content reviewers, and our CCAI advisor. And of course, our Climate Change AI core team, who form communications, community leads, content, and program committees that have contributed tremendously to the shape and form of this Climate Change AI Summer School. Oops, I think I went too far. Hang on. So, and also, I forgot to tell you that we really want to say thank you to all of you. We almost fell out of our chairs by seeing how many of you enrolled for this year. And so it is super important that you consider to fill in the forms for feedback. It will be super important for us to improve our program. So a little bit about the summer school. So this virtual component had 10,000 people register. Again, thank you so much for joining us. These registers are from over 150 countries and more, and I think I'm missing a few of them. More so, 12 days of this summer school are going to be happening over in the next following 6 weeks, 22 different topics in the format of lectures, panels, and lightning talks, and 12 async tutorials so you can get hands-on practice of what we're going to be teaching you. And how to keep up to date to all of this, because we know that things might change. So please subscribe to the calendar on the Google Calendar. I will tell you that about it in 1 second. Look through our website and actually see the links about it, and the community platform, of course. So how the summer school Google Calendar goes. So it looks this beautiful, and obviously we will provide you with a link through our website and our community platform. But note that in order to get notifications, you have to tweak a little bit the settings, in which basically you have to actively click on the notifications as you wish. There's a little bit more a detailed explanation on the community platform. And how to enroll our community platform, which is led by our wonderful Kureha Yamaguchi. You go to the Climate Change AI website. Under the tab of events, the Summer School 2022, you can actually find the first link, that blue link that I'm showing in here in the top of the screen, in order to join directly to the community platform. So asking questions, and why do I direct you to the community platform? All our questions, all your questions throughout the lectures, it would be channeled through the space of lecture Q&A channel from the Climate Change AI community platform, from the space of the summer school. Given the high number of participants, not all the questions will be asked, and questions with more upvotes will get a higher chance of being asked. So, if you get lost, don't be so afraid. The cute red apple emoji will guide you through it. And importantly, please, all participants seriously need to be required to abide the Climate Change AI Code of Conduct. And in case any situation arises, please report to reporting at Climate Change AI. We have a packed schedule. We're going to start off by tackling climate change with machine learning from our wonderful co-founders. We're going to follow up by a little break. Then introduction to climate change with Kamal Kabadia. Follow up by a little break. And finally, least but not least important, introduction to machine learning with our own Dr. Rasika Balarao. And so it is my pleasure to open up the opening session by introducing you to the first lecturers, our co-founders and chairs and executive director, who will be presenting the keynote talk on climate change with machine learning. Dr. Priya Donti is our executive director of climate change AI and is an incoming assistant professor in electrical engineer and computer science at MIT. Her work focuses on machine learning for forecasting, optimization, and control in high renewable power grids. Dr. David Rolnick is an assistant professor and Canada CFAR AI chair in the School of Computer Science at McGill University and at Mila Quebec AI Institute. And his work focuses on applications of machine learning to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis and in deep learning theory. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Lynn Kach is an assistant professor of computer science and public policy at the Hertie School in Berlin. And her work focuses on methods from statistics and machine learning to inform climate mitigation policy across the energy sector and on climate-related AI policy. Floor is all yours, guys. I'm going to stop sharing right now.
You're muted, Priya.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on tackling climate change with machine learning. So climate change is one of the most pressing issues that we as a society are facing today, and we're already seeing its effects from storms to droughts to fires to flooding. These impacts are being felt globally, and they are disproportionately being felt by the world's most disadvantaged populations, which creates a huge imperative to act quickly on this issue. In particular, according to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, we as a society need to hit net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in order to avoid some of the worst effects of climate change. And this is going to require a rapid transformation across virtually every sector of society, so energy, transport, buildings, agriculture, and so forth. So given this huge imperative to act on climate change, one might ask the question, how does machine learning fit into this picture? During today's lecture, we'll aim to give an overview of some answers to this question. So we'll start with a brief introduction to climate change, followed by an overview of the ways in which machine learning can play a role in climate action, and then important considerations for research and deployment. While the majority of this lecture will focus on how machine learning can aid in climate action, it's worth noting that machine learning is a general purpose technology that can have both good and bad effects. So we'll dive a little bit into this broader picture as well. And finally, we'll close with some takeaways and tips on how to get involved. So first, an introduction to climate change. Since the next lecture after this one is fully focused on an intro to climate change, I'm just going to focus on the highlights here. So the Earth has already warmed over 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels as human activities have put an excess of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, so like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. This warming in turn has induced major changes in the climate or the average weather over 10 to 30 years. And we're seeing increased extremes in terms of phenomena like heat waves, precipitation, droughts, and hurricanes. Every unit of greenhouse gas emissions we put into the atmosphere adds further to this warming of the Earth and the subsequent changes in the climate. In particular, this plot from the IPCC shows how much more warming we can expect depending on how rapidly we act. The takeaway is that the faster we act, the less warming we'll see. So for instance, hitting net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 limits warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, a goal that the international community has agreed will help avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. While this target is important and one we should absolutely aim to hit, it's also worth noting that it's not an on-off switch. In the end, every unit of greenhouse gas emissions we avoid putting into the atmosphere will reduce the extent to which the Earth warms. So how do we actually address climate change? There are several different axes of action here, as well as important frameworks that underpin these actions. The first axis of action is climate science. So climate science entails the study of the Earth, the ocean and cryosphere, and the atmosphere in order to understand and predict the extent to which the climate will change. This can then help guide what we should do about it. This area of climate science will be covered in much more depth during day 3 of the summer school. The second axis of action is climate change mitigation, which means preventing emissions and reducing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations in order to reduce the extent to which the climate actually changes. To understand climate change mitigation strategies, it's worth noting that greenhouse gas emissions come from many different sectors, as shown by the plot on the slide and now by the list of sectors that I've just thrown up. And accordingly, strategies to reduce emissions need to also span all these different sectors. There are different strategies to reduce emissions in these different sectors. So for example, for energy-based sectors like energy supply, transport, buildings, and industry, we can use something called the Kaya identity to conceptualize the ways in which we can reduce emissions in these sectors. So by reducing consumption or improving efficiency or switching to clean energy. You'll learn more about the Kaya identity during day 8 of the summer school, with different days focused on deep dives into each of these sectors. For agriculture, forestry, and other land use-based sectors, emissions result from a combination of land use changes, fertilizer use, and livestock. And you'll learn more about strategies for reducing those emissions during day 5 of the summer school, focused on agriculture, forestry, and other land use. The third axis of action is climate change adaptation. So given the effects we are experiencing and that we will experience, how do we respond to those? To understand that, it's worth noting that climate change has some direct effects, which lead to downstream effects we need to adapt to. So these direct effects of climate change include rising temperatures and changing precipitation. And in addition, since oceans have absorbed about 30% of the CO2 we've emitted and 90% of the resulting heat increase, the water has expanded and the ice has melted, causing sea level rise and causing the ocean to acidify. This has led to different downstream effects like droughts and heat waves, more intense storms and flooding, wildfires, loss of ecosystem services and biodiversity, disease spread and pest spread, all of which we need to adapt to. So how do we actually deal with these things? The first step is by understanding the risks we're actually going to face, meaning both the magnitude of impacts and the probability that we'll face them. For instance, this plot from the IPCC is looking at the expected changes in annual mean precipitation globally at different levels of warming. And you can sort of quantify the risk as the impact times the probability of an adverse event. Once you know what these risks look like, the second step is strengthening adaptive capacity against these risks. This involves building both robustness to potential outcomes. So, for example, making sure your power grid doesn't black out when there's a big climate-induced storm, as well as building resilience. So that is, if your power grid does go out, making sure you can bring it back up more quickly. These kinds of strategies need to be applied across human and ecological systems. So considering food security, water security, resilient infrastructure, and ecological conservation, and have a lot of synergies with, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These kinds of strategies are going to be covered in depth for adaptation during, for example, days 6 and 11 of the summer school. In addition to these major axes of action, so climate science, mitigation, and adaptation, there are several important frameworks that underpin these actions. One is climate justice, which basically notes that the brunt of climate change's impacts will be felt by the world's already most disadvantaged populations. And for that and many other reasons, equity needs to be a central consideration in how we approach climate action. Another of these is a co-benefits framework, which notes that it's important to think about climate action holistically and understand how it interacts with other societal priorities like human well-being and ecosystem health. Throughout the summer school, we'll plan to address these considerations as we talk about strategies to act on climate change. So to wrap up, the main takeaways here are that we need really rapid action to address climate change. And these axes of action include climate science, mitigation, and adaptation. Doing these strategies right requires thinking holistically. So for example, considering climate justice and interactions with the Sustainable Development Goals, And many fields and sectors need to be involved in making these kinds of strategies successful. So various fields of science and engineering, economics and the social sciences, public policy, and so forth. And machine learning can play a role in supplementing and strengthening these efforts.
Okay, now that we've seen more about what climate change is, what its effects are, and broadly what's involved in addressing it, let's dive into how machine learning specifically can be useful, with an overview of the different roles that machine learning can play in climate action, as well as considerations to bear in mind when evaluating and prioritizing applications of ML within the climate space. A couple of years ago, Priya, Lynn, and I, along with a multidisciplinary team of other authors, wrote a paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning, which gives a detailed taxonomy and analysis of the different ways that machine learning can be used in climate action. In the full paper, we identified opportunities for ML to play roles across different areas and sectors, from electricity systems, buildings, transportation, to land use, climate prediction, and societal adaptation. While there isn't time here to go through all these applications, I want to highlight a few themes we identified for the kinds of impact that ML can have, which cut across different areas of application. I'll go into each of these themes with examples in the next few slides. Distilling raw data into actionable information, optimizing complex systems, improving predictions, accelerating scientific discovery, and approximating time-intensive simulations. Okay, let's dive into the first theme. There are many ways in which ML can help advance climate action by taking some huge raw data set and going through it to pick out actionable information, which might be too slow or cumbersome for a human to do at scale. Often in these situations, the raw data is a set of images, for example, satellite or aerial imagery, or a corpus of text. And so computer vision and natural language processing are often relevant. One example of where this role for ML comes up is in mapping deforestation in real time. Increasingly, machine learning is being used to parse satellite images to work out where forests are being cut down for agriculture, timber, or mining. This can be valuable in guiding policy decisions, as well as interventions in cases where forests are protected. Mapping deforestation is also useful for verification in carbon markets, where landowners get financial benefits if they can prove that they're conserving their land. Mapping carbon stock is a related task where ML for remote sensing is also being used. This means quantifying the amount of carbon that's stored in a forest, a grassland, or another area of land in order to better determine the value from an emissions perspective of preserving that land. Another setting in which ML is being used to parse raw satellite data is in gathering information on buildings. There's very little publicly available info about what buildings are where and how much energy they use, which makes it difficult to shape policies. Using computer vision, it's possible to approximate the footprints and heights of buildings from which their energy use can in turn be approximated. Now, these are both examples of tools for climate change mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's why I put a little M in brackets there. Now, we can look at some examples also from adaptation, responding to the effects of climate change. ML has been used, for example, to correct errors in global elevation maps, so as to pinpoint coastal communities that are at risk from flooding. By working out the exact heights of different areas, these algorithms have made it possible to determine that hundreds of millions more people are at risk than had been previously thought. As an example from natural language processing, NLP, there's a lot of information in corporate financial disclosures that can be useful in informing climate policy decisions. For example, what risks companies anticipate from climate change. Training topic modeling algorithms to pick out relevant passages has sped up the process of finding this information. Overall, we've seen ML algorithms can be very useful in distilling big raw data sets into actionable information that can guide policies or other kinds of decisions. Moving on to our second theme, let's consider settings in which ML can help operate complex automated systems more efficiently. A wide variety of algorithms can be relevant here, from classic optimization techniques to reinforcement learning. ML is being used to control heating and cooling systems more efficiently so that they use less power. This is true both for smart thermostats in personal homes and also in the more challenging cases of large buildings and industrial processes. Increasingly, ML is being used to help optimize transportation schedules. For example, the timetable of the German railway operator Deutsche Bahn incorporates ML. This can also help in allowing different modes of transport, like trains and buses or trucks, to interface smoothly for public transportation and freight. ML can also be used to guide demand response, in which certain activities that require electricity but are flexible on when that electricity is used, like charging an electric car or running a dishwasher, can be timed to occur when there's a surplus of power or when it's coming from low carbon sources. Now, note that in situations where ML is being asked to optimize a system, the objective function is very important. In particular, it's not always aligned with climate action. For example, reducing cost may end up reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but not always. It's also worth noting that making a process more efficient can sometimes increase the amount that people use it. This is called a rebound effect, and it can diminish the savings one gets from improved efficiency. Moving on to our next theme, ML can be helpful in improving predictions and forecasts across many different application areas. A variety of time series analysis techniques can be relevant here, including Bayesian methods and sometimes computer vision techniques in settings with image-based data. As an example, on an electrical grid, the power being generated needs to match the power being consumed at each point in time. Fossil fuel power plants can largely be controlled to vary the amount of power being generated, but for solar and wind, the power being generated varies from minute to minute, depending on the sun and wind conditions. ML is starting to be used to forecast how much wind and solar power will be available, including by using historical time series data and satellite imagery of clouds. This makes it possible to use more wind and solar and less power from fossil fuels. Similarly, ML is being used to forecast the amount of demand for electrical power from time series data. The UK's national grid recently implemented ML algorithms that cut in half the error in their power demand forecasts. As another example, this time relevant to adaptation, ML is being used to help forecast crop yield from satellite images in response to the threat climate change poses to agriculture and food security. Our next theme is accelerating scientific discovery. There are many settings in which new materials or other technologies can advance climate action, but the process of perfecting such tech takes huge amounts of experimentation. In some cases, ML can speed up the process, not by removing the need for physical experimentation, but by helping design new experimental setups. Such algorithms can include generative models, active learning, and reinforcement learning, and where chemical compounds are concerned, often involve graph neural networks. In the case of materials design, ML can be used to learn from the outcomes of past experiments to suggest promising new materials. This can be valuable in the design of new compounds for batteries, photovoltaic cells, and catalysts used in green energy applications. As another example, reinforcement learning methods were recently developed that can effectively control plasma in experiments on nuclear fusion, which is a potential future source of low carbon energy. Now, for our final theme, let's turn to the ways in which ML is used to approximate simulations. Physics-based simulations turn up in many climate-relevant areas, and while calculations based on known physical laws are highly accurate, they can also be slow, and ML can be used to produce faster approximate answers. Relevant ML methods can include physics-informed techniques, computer vision, and interpretable or causal methods. As one example, climate models are complex ensembles of physics-based simulations, how variables like temperature and precipitation behave around the globe. These models can take months to run, even on powerful computational infrastructure. Even then, climate models normally operate at relatively coarse spatial resolution, like hundreds of kilometers, since higher resolution could be prohibitively computationally expensive. However, that limits the utility of these models in informing local measures for climate adaptation. ML-based super resolution techniques are therefore being used to increase the spatial resolution of certain pieces of climate models. This is also called downscaling. In a totally different setting, ML is being used to approximate certain portions of car aerodynamic simulations in order to design more fuel-efficient vehicles. And in the power sector, ML can speed planning models used to simulate electrical grids, which are again based on domain physics and can be extremely slow. Okay, we've seen a number of climate-relevant applications of ML across many different sectors and fields, with ML playing roles in distilling data into useful insights, optimizing complex systems, improving predictions, accelerating scientific discovery, and approximating simulations. If you're interested in further details, I encourage you to check out the interactive version of the Tackling Climate Change with ML paper, which is available at climatechange.ai/summaries, where you can search for different applications by theme, subject area, or ML technique. I want to now go under the hood a bit and talk about the process that we used for evaluating and prioritizing applications when we wrote that paper. There were a number of questions that we found to be very useful in shaping our thinking, and there's still a useful framework for me when I'm considering a new potential project. First, is ML needed to address the problem? There are many urgent problems related to climate change where ML, unfortunately, isn't going to be helpful. There are also problems that have already been solved without using ML and where the existing solution is perfectly fine. What is the scope of the impact? You don't have to work on problems that could reduce megatons of CO2. More modest gains add up. But at the same time, working on, say, reducing plastic straw use might not be the best use of time. It's good to have at least a ballpark sense of how meaningful a problem is from a climate perspective. What is the time horizon of the impact? A ton of CO2 reduced now is much more impactful than a ton of CO2 reduced in 30 years, since the sooner we can achieve net zero, the lower the damage. This is one reason why planting trees, while important, is generally a lower priority than preserving the trees we have. Similarly, working on techniques like nuclear fusion, which at best are decades away from success and scalability, can be valuable, but shouldn't distract from nearer-term solutions. What is the likelihood that a solution can be found? It's very tempting to work on moonshots that have some small probability of huge impact, but often it's better to work on problems with a high probability of medium impact. Also, sometimes those moonshots have a long time horizon, which we've seen as less ideal. Can a solution feasibly be deployed? The best algorithm in the world isn't going to have an impact if nobody uses it. Sometimes ML works, but it isn't scalable in the relevant setting, for example, because of hardware costs, expertise required to run and maintain it, or access to annotated data. What are the potential side effects of deploying the candidate solution? An optimization algorithm might reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but increase other human costs. A system for gathering data on vulnerable populations could be co-opted by bad actors. Depending on the situation, it may not be feasible to avoid all negative side effects, but where possible, they should be recognized upfront and mitigated. Who are the relevant stakeholders who are involved in or affected by the application? They may have constraints or requirements that need to be built into any viable solution, and it is through their eyes that an approach should be judged. Finally, I'd like to highlight a number of considerations to bear in mind when thinking about the overall space of ML applications in climate action. First, remembering that ML is not a silver bullet. It's only one of the many tools we need, and it's not applicable everywhere. It should never replace or distract from other actions involved in fighting climate change. Second, some of the most impactful and interesting applications aren't flashy. For instance, detecting failures in railroad systems doesn't receive as much press as autonomous driving, but from a climate perspective, it's probably more beneficial. We'll talk more about this later. Sometimes to find those non-flashy problems, you really have to dive deeply into understanding what is needed within a particular area of application. Third, the flashiest methods in machine learning also aren't always needed. I'll dive into this point in more detail in a moment. When thinking about climate applications of machine learning, it's essential to conceive of them as collaborations, including both ML experts and domain experts. Often other stakeholders who are involved in deployment or affected by the technology should be included too. These kinds of partnerships are important to make sure that the algorithms aren't solving the wrong problem, and that where possible, they leverage domain-specific knowledge. Partnerships are also key in shaping a pathway to impactful deployment and ensuring that any deployment-relevant considerations are built into the design right from the start. Lastly, equity considerations are fundamentally important, including who is building solutions, what problems are prioritized, and how these problems are worked on. Empowering a diverse and global set of stakeholders is essential to ensure that technologies are owned by the people affected by them, rather than reinforcing existing power imbalances across countries and institutions. Related to the question of who is the question of what is being worked on, since problem priorities often reflect existing inequities within ML and technology more broadly. For instance, ML to fight wildfires, which is a key problem in North America, Europe, Australia, tends to receive more attention and funding than ML to fight locusts, which affects East Africa, the Middle East, and India, even though both problems are extremely important and are exacerbated by climate change. And how problems are worked on is also important. Data imbalances between regions or between communities within a region can mean ML solutions are only applicable to a subset of the population, or that algorithms are most effective within data-rich areas. Ideally, ML for climate will serve to improve equity, but this takes active work at the level of project design and management. Now, as I noted above, while state-of-the-art methods for machine learning can be useful, in other cases, simpler methods may be enough. One shouldn't leap to using transformers when linear regression will do the trick. ChatGPT may seem like the cool new thing, but in most climate-relevant applications, it's useless. And in some cases, it would be actively harmful because it's basically impossible to make it trustworthy. Where innovations in machine learning are useful, they tend to be motivated not by whatever works the best on standard benchmark ML datasets, but by the needs of specific application domains. Here are some common themes that often turn up. In many applications like climate modeling or power grid optimization, there are constraints that arise from system physics. Incorporating energy conservation, power flow, or the properties of chemical bonds is often hard for standard black box ML algorithms, but it may be necessary if the answers are going to be meaningful. In some cases, such constraints reflect engineering needs that will lead to system failure if they're violated. For example, a blackout in the power grid. Notions of robustness are also meaningful here, though robustness can mean different things in ML and in particular application domains. For example, robust control algorithms require a notion of Lyapunov stability that's quite far from the ML notion of robustness under adversarial perturbation. In various situations where ML models are providing information to key stakeholders, interpretable predictions are essential, both to ensure stakeholder buy-in and to enable algorithmic oversight and accountability. Causal models of how predictions are made may also be useful, building on the increasing set of tools available at the intersection of causal inference and ML. In similar settings, uncertainty quantification can be very important too. Generic ML models often have very poorly calibrated uncertainty, which can make it very difficult to use ML-derived insights in decision-making. Generalization is a common challenge across ML, and in climate-relevant settings, these challenges can take a number of different forms. Algorithms may be called upon to perform a similar task like land cover classification across geographies, where data may be different in ways that require domain transfer and adaptation. Data may be non-stationary and change over time, for example, weather patterns varying as the climate changes. And data may be limited or imbalanced, as with extreme events or long-tail distributions of biodiversity data. Now, we talk about all these areas and more in our tutorial for ICML 2022, which is available online. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to check that resource out.
Awesome. So we covered a lot of ground just there in terms of, the ways in which machine learning can help address climate action. And now we want to turn to some important considerations for research and deployment. And as a reminder, if you have questions throughout this lecture, please do drop them in the community platform and we'll get to them at the end of the lecture. So in working on machine learning or any technique to address a climate relevant problem, it's important to understand the broader pathway to impact in which the work is situated. In particular, it's necessary to scope the problem, understand what other tools and approaches already exist, and understand how the machine learning, if it's needed at all, will interact with these existing tools and approaches. Downstream from the machine learning, it's important to understand how the solution will be analyzed and deployed, and what other potential consequences or side effects it might have, things like rebound effects, equity impacts, and so forth, and to make sure to incorporate these considerations when developing algorithms in the first place. A part of this pathway to impact involves getting a sense of what data, simulators, and evaluation metrics may already exist, as well as what needs to be created. On the data side, creating data can entail many different kinds of things depending on what's available. So data collection, but also annotation or collation, or inferring information from proxies, or even just figuring out how to properly license data that already exists. It's worth noting here that different communities have very different notions of what data or a data set look like. So it's important to work together and calibrate expectations in this respect. In addition to static data sets, simulators and test beds are particularly important for control and optimization problems on physical domains like power grids, buildings, and heavy industry. And then importantly, evaluation metrics are key. These metrics should cover what it means for a method to directly be successful, but also measure potential side effects or negative consequences or other factors you need to holistically understand the solution. Developing good metrics requires involvement from multiple kinds of stakeholders, as well as consistent reevaluation to make sure the metrics continue to make sense. A few resources I'll point out here include the Climate Change AI Dataset Wishlist, which poses different kinds of datasets that could be useful to create. Entities like the Lacuna Fund, which provide funding for dataset creation, particularly in low and middle income contexts. And the NeurIPS Datasets and Benchmarks Track, which is a potential venue to publish and disseminate datasets to spur further work. When thinking about the impacts of work in this space, the broader conversation on responsible AI is also very applicable, and it can play out in important ways in climate change related contexts. So for example, there are many places where data and algorithms can create or perpetuate bias. For instance, machine learning is used for building energy efficiency retrofits to try to identify which buildings are more likely to succeed in a retrofit for the lowest costs. But factors like housing discrimination and generational wealth have affected the current state of which buildings are more efficient now. And that means that algorithms trained on this data might replicate these historical inequities and biases. We need to focus both on cleaning up the data and on being thoughtful about how the algorithm is used in order to avoid this. Data on buildings is also unevenly available across geographies, and this can potentially bias interventions as well. Modeling choices can also perpetuate bias. So for example, physics-based weather models are often calibrated based on observational data, and the choice of calibration data affects who the model performs well for. So for example, there's more sensor data on weather available in Europe than in Africa, which means our weather models are almost certainly performing better in Europe than in Africa because of these calibration choices. In addition to bias, trustworthiness and accountability are also important considerations, making sure you can really trust or interpret the outputs of your model, especially in, when making policies or in other sensitive contexts. And then equity considerations are, of course, extremely important, considering the intersection of responsible AI and climate justice. Important actions in this area include centering diverse stakeholders. So for example, not working just with wealthy industrial agriculture stakeholders, but also smallholder farmers. Another is ensuring that personnel, capacity, compute, expertise, and access are not just concentrated within a few institutions and geographies, but making sure that they're democratized so that a broad set of stakeholders can participate in and benefit from ML for climate work. And another is avoiding digital colonialism, which is when those in developed countries use data from developing countries with little involvement from or benefit for the populations whose data is being used. So this can be things like exploiting differences in privacy regulations around personal energy use data, or by analyzing satellite imagery from afar without deeply engaging local populations. That sort of deep engagement of the people whose data it is extremely important. That can be a lot to keep in mind. And so if I had to impart one meta level tip here, it would be to work with the correct stakeholders to make sure that these considerations come to the front. This includes researchers from multiple disciplines, deployment partners, end users, policymakers, and also other parties who might not be directly involved in deploying the technology, but may nonetheless be affected by its deployment or use. And importantly, it's not just about engagement, but in fact, meaningful engagement, where different stakeholders are really able to drive and shape the progress. I'd refer you to this classic stakeholder engagement paper on Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation in order to learn more about that. So to sum it up, when working explicitly on ML for climate problems, it's important to understand how your ML algorithm is situated within its broader pathway to impact, to work on the infrastructure part rather than just the methods part. So for example, the creation of data, simulators, and metrics, to understand and mitigate any negative downstream effects and side effects that the work might have, and to engage with stakeholders across the entire pathway.
Okay, thanks, Priya. We will now briefly discuss in which ways machine learning can actually be a help or a hindrance for climate action. And we will discuss how to think about measuring the carbon footprint of machine learning and what everyone can do also to shape the overall impact of machine learning. And more on this topic will come on day 9, impacts and regulation of AI and climate change. So we've talked so far about how machine learning can help with addressing climate change, but there are also ways that machine learning can potentially hurt the climate. And many of you have probably thought about the computational emissions from machine learning. And while this is a problem, it's not the only way that machine learning can increase emissions. In fact, machine learning is a multi-purpose technology, and it can be applied in ways that both increase and decrease emissions. And lastly, machine learning also interacts with a larger technological, social, and economic system. And that can be in ways that can help or hinder climate change mitigation. And in this part, we will talk about all of these aspects in a bit more detail to understand how machine learning affects emissions. So let's start with the emissions from machine learning computation and hardware. Emissions from machine learning training, they differ significantly between the model types, and they also depend on whether a model is fine-tuned or trained from scratch. And this plot here shows how large the CO2 emissions are from training different models, and it compares those to the emissions from other typical activities, such as driving a car for a mile. So notice the log scale here. The most energy-intensive model with 6 billion parameters that's listed in this plot emits as much as powering a typical home for a year. On the other side, we have the activity of fine-tuning BERT, which is a common thing to do in practice. This is a language model, and this compares to consuming less than a liter of gasoline per training run. And then what we can also see here in this plot is that the size of the model matters a lot for how much energy is consumed during training. So here we have different sizes of the same model, the vision transformer. So what the authors of this paper measure here are operational emissions. Those come from the energy consumed during computation. And the way we can address this, one factor that's important here is the energy efficiency of the data centers that we're training or doing inference on. And the data center efficiency can be improved with more efficient hardware, better cooling, or the use of waste heat for heating homes, for example. The emissions also depend on the type of electricity used. So using renewable energy improves the carbon footprint considerably. And data centers also have this opportunity to help integrate more renewable energy into the grid by providing a load that's flexible. But operational emissions are not the only part. They're also the so-called embodied emissions. And what do we mean by that? So producing computer hardware also emits greenhouse gas emissions. And for example, this is through mining and manufacturing, through transportation, or through disposing of unused hardware. And this last picture here also illustrates how important are other environmental impact in this picture and social impacts as well. So we will discuss how to measure computing-related emissions from machine learning as a whole in the lecture on day 9. So let's take another look at the application impacts of machine learning. Earlier in this lecture, we learned about the different ways that machine learning can be used to reduce emissions, which are summarized in this figure. And I wanted to highlight one aspect of this figure, which is indicated by the red bubble. Machine learning can also increase emissions. For example, if it's applied in the oil and gas sector to improve exploration, there could help to increase the amount of oil and gas that's extracted. And this is actually happening in reality. Currently, there don't really exist standard ways to measure such application-related impacts, both in decreasing and increasing emissions. This might be actually quite easy for certain case studies, for example, for energy efficiency measures. But for others, it may actually be quite difficult for example, if you're using machine learning for battery R&D. So I wanted to walk you through an example of AI applied for efficiency in crude oil refining to illustrate that there is also a broader scope to consider. And here, this is an example where we're actually turning crude oil into lighter hydrocarbons by using heat from coker units. And there's a need to accurately predict the coke buildup in pipes, and machine learning can actually considerably help here. And this helps to maintain equipment and reduce the energy consumption. So, of course, this application of machine learning is reducing the emissions in the refinery. But what it also does is reducing costs. And here, we need to consider how the application that is reducing cost of oil products is affecting emissions from the energy and economic system as a whole. So you can see there like these trickle-down effects to the system level. And this is what we mean with this last point of that we're making of machine learning system level impacts. So to recap, the major categories of ways that machine learning affects emissions is through its computation and hardware, the immediate impacts of its applications, both good and bad, and the system-wide changes that machine learning can induce. So what can you do? So if you are looking at the computation-related emissions, there are actually tools that help you measure the footprint that are even sometimes specifically integrated, for example, into Azure or Hugging Face. And you can also reduce your impact by choosing more efficient models, for example, distill BERT instead of BERT, and reducing wasteful model retraining and execution. Then regarding what you apply those machine learning algorithms to, it's important that you try to quantify and evaluate the application impacts where possible, and that you're transparent about the impacts in publications and with stakeholders. There's really a danger to do greenwashing as well here. So be clear about what you consider the impacts of your application. And then ultimately, of course, you can also choose what you or the machine learning community more broadly works on. This last part of our lecture now has even more takeaways and tips how to get involved into the space. So first of all, there are many job opportunities in the space. Those are in traditional academic research, institutes, startups, tech companies, but also consider tech teams in non-tech companies, for example, in the energy sector. There are also jobs connected to the public sector, for example, in funding and data, procurement, and in policy making. So if you're working on machine learning, you can include climate-relevant applications in the set of problems that motivate your work. And it's important that you build those collaborations with domain experts for those areas. If you're working on climate-related problems, you can learn about relevant machine learning methods and build collaborations with machine learning experts as well. So if you're coming from the machine learning and tech side, working explicitly on climate problems isn't always the only way to help. You can also think about how to better align your existing projects with climate goals. And ultimately, I wanted to highlight also that sometimes becoming a bridge between machine learning and a specific sector is an interesting option. So for example, you're becoming an expert in machine learning and agriculture. So as you're learning, you may want to turn to dedicated communities to get involved. And these are often centered around different domains like climate science, for example. And they often run regular events. And if you are working on research and you're looking to publish, there are workshops at machine learning conferences. There's a special track of JMLR. We have journals like the Environmental Data Science Journal dedicated to this space, ACM Compass, and there are many other domain-specific and also general interest venues that people publish in this area. So if you're interested in highlights from these communities and things around research and industry and policy, check out the Climate Change Monthly newsletter. So similarly, you may actually want to get your hands dirty and try working with data sets or participating in challenges. And here, likewise, these are often centered around the domains. And you can find out what community is relevant for your area of interest at the wiki that we have built at Climate Change AI. And you can work yourself on these topics by working through the tutorials that we are also providing on the website. So lastly, I wanted to point out that another way to engage with questions around machine learning and climate change is by working with policymakers. And many governments are actually looking towards regulating AI currently, or even putting programs in place that are dedicated to AI and climate change. And your expertise can be really helpful here. So if you want to involve or be involved in policy making, a first step is to condense information to make it useful for policy makers. For example, you can see here a report that we wrote together with a global partnership on AI. And another main avenue for input to the policymaking process is in form of written feedback to proposed legislation. Legislators often require this kind of feedback from experts and the public, since they may not be able to think about all relevant issues as they are designing a law. So an example of such requests for feedback is currently open by the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the US. And they explicitly ask for input on how AI may affect US greenhouse gas emissions and climate goals. And one can submit feedback until July 7. Such feedback rounds are typically open to anyone. CCI has in the past submitted such a feedback to the EU AI Act. And this is another major upcoming regulation of AI that previously didn't include anything regarding regulating AI's environmental and climate impact. And now it's still currently in the process of being discussed, and the Parliament has made significant amendments to change that. So we're going to talk more about policy on day 9. So this is the final slide where I just wanted to tell you about all the things that climate change AI does and how we provide you with resources to get started in this area. So we've written a number of foundational reports on climate change and AI. We've mentioned a couple in this lecture, and we've provided this wiki that you can contribute to online. Then you're currently participating in one of our events, the summer school, but we also have a workshop series at large AI conferences and domain conferences. Then we have a funding program for research projects, which is in its second iteration at the moment. We also provide resources in the form of a newsletter and a blog, and we have this community that you can ask questions on this lecture in. We regularly also run webinars and happy hours, so there's a way to regularly attend events and engage with the community. And if you want to find out more about how to engage with this space, so check out our website and engage with us on social media. Okay, and now the floor is open for questions, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, guys, that was an impressive lecture. I think you kind of solved all my questions and that I had, but there's a few from the different questions that we have received. There's several questions in regards to features and how you can actually expand models with additional features. For a specific question that was in the time horizon for impact, it's do ML models account for human society related variables such as political challenges to implementation of nuclear power plants or citizens' behavior, attitude towards potential solution, and even economic factors and so. And the question is, Angle, if these variables are accounted in the models, or are they hard to acquire or implement?
So I would say it's a really good question. Generally speaking, the ML model isn't being asked to do something so big picture that there's a need to do that. It's more a situation of that would be something that would help you decide whether you should be using an algorithm in a certain context. ML models normally aren't simulating climate action or something like that. They would be simulating a particular piece of the climate or a particular kind of action that could be taken.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
and so one way ML is used in these kind of big, economic decision-making or policy decision-making processes is you'll often write down some kind of, rule-based model or economic model or something you're trying to solve. And then sometimes if that model is overly computationally intensive, you can use machine learning to, approximate parts of that model or otherwise speed up the overall model. But in general, kind of machine learning to forecast a macro scale decision is not usually where it's used.
Gotcha. There's another question of how you prioritize. So from the greenhouse gas emissions, if you have to choose industry, building, transportation, power grids, and etc., do you have a specific priority? How do you put a priority? Where to start, basically, I think.
Yeah, I can jump on that. I think first of all, it's important what you are interested in and where you think you have most leverage. So if it's a sector that I think is close to your methods, your interest, your knowledge, of course, you have more leverage in this. Then between different sectors, we have currently different stages of decarbonization, so of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. The electricity sector is quite advanced in many countries, so the technology is actually quite ready. And other sectors are more difficult to decarbonize. Transportation, for example, is lagging behind, or industry. So you have different kinds of challenges with different sectors. That being said, everything is important. It really matters to do something and to do it close to your interest and to work on a project that you think is impactful.
That's great. Yes, it's very exciting. I have another couple more questions. So I have a very interesting question. It's like, what is the plan for communities, especially with vulnerable women and people living in disabilities concerning AI? So what is the plan with that, if any?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, in general, I think there have to be more initiatives that aim to democratize infrastructure and capacity building among a wider range of people. So the Climate Change AI Summer School is an initiative trying to do this, but there are some others as well, where the goal is that in general, people from different populations should have the ability to understand AI, to implement AI, to shape the way it's developed. And only by democratizing capacity in this way can we really create AI-enabled climate solutions that are really representative of the challenges and priorities across society. So I would say that the first order priority is always capacity building and knowledge building across a wide range of people.
Okay, and last one, before we enter a small, very, very flash break, is can you talk more about rebound effects?
Sure. So in various settings, you are making a process more efficient or lower energy, lower emissions. That can result in lower costs, and that can mean that people use it more. This is not the case in every situation. Sometimes lowering the emissions doesn't lower the cost to the consumer. And sometimes lowering the cost doesn't increase the demand for it. Some things just everything gets better, and you don't use the thing more. But in certain cases, you can end up partially or even fully negating the benefits that you get from making something more efficient if the demand increases. So this is not a reason to not to work on making things more efficient, but it is a reason to think very carefully about the area that you're working in and understand when rebound effects apply and to what extent they apply, because sometimes they apply a little, sometimes they apply tremendously. And so it's very problem dependent. This isn't something where you should say, oh, well, that means I shouldn't work on any of these problems.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was an excellent lecture, and I hope everybody is as pumped and excited for all the information you have provided. And thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I believe we will be taking a very, very small break, and then we will jump into the next lecture.
Hello.
Hi, Kamal. We are taking a brief pause. So let's start. 1 second. We are. So welcome back. It is my pleasure to make the introduction to climate change by Dr. Kamal Kapadia. Briefly, she is the co-founder and chief of education from Terra.do. She has had a stellar career from going to really well-renowned institutions from Oxford to Berkeley, and she will be giving us an overview of Introduction to Climate Change. Kamal, I'll set up that brief introduction for you to share screen.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Just give me a second. Let me see if I can share this screen. Sorry, just give me a second here. Not finding the thing for some reason. All right, got it. Sorry about that tiny delay. Is everybody able to see my slides? Can you just give me a thumbs up? Excellent. Okay. Thanks again, Olivia. I am Kamal Kapadia. I am very excited to be here doing this talk for the summer school. I have titled my talk, Meaningful Climate Action. And in this session, I'm hoping to accomplish 3 things. First, I'm going to give you an overview of the scope of the challenge of climate change. Second, I will provide some frameworks for thinking about the solutions. And third, I want to provide some pointers on how you personally can engage in meaningful climate action. So let's jump right in. So there's this structure I like to use when thinking about this idea of meaningful climate action, and it revolves around 2 concepts. One is truth, and the other is courageous action. So we're going to dive into both sides of this today in this talk. But first, I'd like to start with a quick check-in. And I request Amanda and Olivia to share a little poll. And this poll just asks a very simple question. On a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel? Do you feel very relaxed, like the kitten, or very anxious, like the hamster? 1 being very relaxed, 5 being very anxious. And there is a purpose to this check-in, and I will talk about it later in this talk. So just work with me right now. Just do a little check-in. And sometimes it's useful when you're trying to figure out how you feel to just close your eyes, take a deep breath, and just check in with your body. Because we often hold stress in our body. So check in your belly. Is your stomach tight? In your chest? Is your chest feeling constricted? Shoulders and neck. We often hold stress in our shoulders and necks. Take another deep breath. Your forehead. Is your forehead all tight? So just check in and tell us how you feel. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to give you a moment to do this poll. And then I'll request Olivia and Amanda to just share their screens and share the results.
See? Please, everyone is in the comments. So make sure that you're clicking out there.
And again, there is a purpose to this. I'll talk more about this later in this session. But I'm just curious to see how folks are doing.
We might be having a technical issue at this point.
All right, here's what I suggest. Just write down this number, okay? Write down this number for yourself. Write it down because you're going to need to refer to it later. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and we're just going to continue. All right, so coming back to this structure, we're going to start with what's on the left-hand side, which is the truth part of this, because there are some hard truths we have to face as we're doing this work. So the first thing, and this is pretty obvious to all of you who are here, hopefully, climate change is real and we are the cause. Just a little reminder, even though I'm sure you all know this very well by now, this graph shows us carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over 800,000 years. This graph was produced by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a federal research agency in the United States. They do a lot of climate science research. And on the x-axis is a measure of, it's just time. So it goes back 800,000 years. And now, thanks to ice core data from Antarctica, we can track carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over this very long period. And as you can see, it has been varying over time. But this is where we are now. Actually, this is 2021. So you can see we are in some pretty uncharted territory. And actually now it's even higher, I think around 421 or 22 parts per million in 2023. So we are in some pretty uncharted territory with carbon dioxide concentrations for at least the last 800,000 years. And the reason, of course, that we care about carbon dioxide is because it is our chief greenhouse gas of concern. Greenhouse gases are gases that trap heat close to the Earth. And because they trap heat close to the Earth, they are driving a global temperature change. And so this is another graph, and you might be familiar with these stripes. These colors are now used all the time. They use on climate Twitter. You might even have seen it on mugs, etc. They were first created as a visual to show and demonstrate the impact of climate change on the Earth by Ed Hawkins, who is a climate scientist at the University of Reading. Now, this graph doesn't go quite as far back in time. It's just to about the start of the Industrial Revolution, 1850. And what this graph shows is a global temperature change relative to an average for 1971 to 2000. And you can just see from the colors how this has been changing over time, and especially what's been happening since the late, like say 1980s or so. And so not only is global average temperature going up, but the pace of this change is also accelerating. And of course, we know that we are the drivers of this. This is a graph that just shows global carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and land use change. Fossil fuels are basically oil, gas, and coal, and we burn them chiefly for energy. Land use change is just a change in, an example of land use change is deforestation in order to expand land for agriculture. And the total emissions keep going up. This tiny little dip is COVID, but it's continuing to go up. So again, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are increasing because we are burning fossil fuels and engaging in other activities that are increasing the concentrations. And of course, carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas of concern, but it is the chief greenhouse gas of concern. But there are other important ones as well. The second important thing to know, a truth to face, is climate change is here and now. Now, when I first got into this space, we, like in the late 1990s, we used to still speak of climate change as something that was going to happen in the future. Even though we were already, I mean, especially if you look at the observations, global climate observations, we were already experiencing climate change even then, but it was still something that we spoke of in the future. This is definitely no longer the case. We are feeling these impacts everywhere, all around the world, all the time. Now, every time I do a version of this talk, I have to find different images of different natural disasters from around the world because they are coming so fast. We keep experiencing disasters everywhere. This is an image from just last week, cyclone Biparjoy that hit Pakistan and parts of Western India. And many of you may have seen this image. This is New York City from a few weeks ago, and the skies are orange with smoke from the wildfires in eastern Canada. So the smoke had blown all the way over a big swaths of eastern US as well. And of course, you may be asking, well, do these wildfires happen anyway? Is this just, unusual because the winds happen to blow in this direction? And I think this graph captures it pretty well. This graph shows us cumulative hectares burned in wildfires in Canada, and you can see where we are in 2023. So not only have these fires taken off much early in what we are now calling a fire season, but the cumulative hectares burned is already higher than any other year so far. Another question you may have is like, how do we know if climate change is playing a role in these disasters? And we don't have time in this talk to really get into this, but there is a science called extreme weather attribution. And I think this is certainly an area in which data science ML plays a really big role as well. And so if you are interested in this space, so what this work of research does is they are able to quantify how climate change is influencing the intensity and the likelihood of these extreme weather events. So if you're interested in this, I strongly recommend checking out this resource. It's the World Weather Attribution website. And every time there is a new extreme weather event, they are able to quickly go in and do one of these attribution studies and look at the extent to which climate change has influenced any given particular event. A couple more things on this point that climate change is here and now. I want to draw your attention to this graph. You may have seen it if you're on climate Twitter or have been reading the news. This was featured in the media recently. So this is a graph of sea surface temperatures, global sea surface temperatures. And you can see on the x-axis is just months of the year. On the y-axis is actual temperature in degrees Celsius. And every one of these wavy lines represents 1 year of measurements. So this orange line is actually last year, and this black line is this year. And this graph is updated all the time. So you can see this is very, very recent from basically just a few days ago. And this is where we are right now with sea surface temperatures. Now, mind you, I want to call out that we are currently in what is also known as an El Nino event. This is a particular kind of weather. It's actually a natural event that occurs in the Pacific Ocean. It has to do with the currents. It creates warming cycles separate from climate change. But we have experienced El Nino events in the past as well, and we are still in extremely uncharted territory with global sea surface temperatures. So many scientists are expecting a pretty brutal summer. And of course, all of this has real human impacts, right? It affects everybody. And there are many, many ways to talk about these human impacts. In the interest of time, I'm only going to draw your attention to one way in which we can be thinking and understanding what's going on with climate change impact on humans. There is this amazing series of stories that were co-produced by ProPublica and the New York Times, and they're called The Great Climate Migration. And it talks about how climate change is fueling migration around the world. So we're not just talking about global migration, which is mainly global south to global north migration, but also domestic migration in the United States. And in this story, they cite research that says right now only 1% of the Earth is an unlivable hot zone. And by 2070, even with just middle emission scenarios, we could see 19% of the land being an unlivable hot zone. So this is just one of the massive human systems we are disrupting and sending people fleeing from their homes for safety. Now, so climate change is real. We are the cause. It's here and now. And all the scientists are telling us that exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius of average temperature increase compared to pre-industrial is dangerous. Now, I want to call out a couple of things here. One is that we are already somewhere between 1.1 to 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. So that's where we are right now, average global warming. And it's important to not see this 1.5 C as some strict line. It's more of a point on a continuum when we are really crossing more into these multiple danger zones. This is a graphic that's taken from IPCC, and I'll talk a little bit about the IPCC in a few slides as well. But what this graph just really shows is that as we increase temperatures, risks of various bad things happening just go up, right? And we get into some pretty dangerous zones as we are crossing 1.5 C. So for example, extreme weather events, those risks go up, or if you look down here, if impacts on warm water corals, those risks significantly increase as well. Unfortunately, we are almost guaranteed to cross 1.5 C now, although some people have different perspectives on this. So I don't want to say it's definitely a given. There are still scenarios in which we could stay under 1.5 C of global warming, or at least jump above a little bit and come right back down again, if we can really all rally together and get our act together. And I just want to spend a little time on this graph. And I promise you this is going to be the last graph for a while. But I think this is an important graph. And I want to spend a little time just breaking it down. So this graph was produced by Climate Action Tracker. And what Climate Action Tracker does is they look at all of the policies, actions, pledges, targets that countries around the world are committing to and putting in place. And they translate that into emission scenarios and expected temperature ranges that we would reach by 2100. So let's spend a few minutes on this graph. So on the x-axis is just years. On the y-axis is global greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just a metric that combines all different greenhouse gases into one metric per year. So this black line is a measure of our historic emissions. So you just see what we're emitting every year. This tiny little dip is COVID. And of course, we're right back up again. Now I want to focus on three things on the right-hand side of this graph. So first is big blue wedge. So what Climate Action Tracker has done is that they have taken all the policies and actions of all the countries and they've added it up, and they have said if you take all these policies and actions, this is the expected future emissions that we will be kind of in this range. It's a range, and these are the expected temperatures, 2.6 to 2.9 C, that we would be at if you add up all the current policies and actions by 2100. So clearly this is way above where we need to be, but this is kind of where we are. Now, another thing I want to draw your attention to is this light blue line that says pledges and targets. Now, pledges and targets actually has us getting to closer to 2 degrees C. And the reason pledges and targets is different from policies and actions is because every single country in the world now, officially, governments, or most countries, let's say the vast majority of countries, have some kind of climate action target. So they say, they have some kind of carbon neutrality goal or net zero goal, or they're making efforts, or they are at least making some pledges and setting some targets for themselves. Sometimes it's just some kind of efficiency goals, but they have various goals. But the problem is these goals are not really translating into policies that are as ambitious as the goals need. So this is why there is a discrepancy between pledges and targets versus policies and actions. So even in the United States, where we just passed this landmark federal legislation, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically a massive piece of climate legislation. If you just take the IRA, it is not enough to get the US to be within its 1.5 C emissions contributions. So IRA alone won't get us to 1.5 C for the United States. So this is why there is this discrepancy. And of course, the pathway we need to be on is this green line. if we really want to be 1.5C compatible by 2100. So we need to be rapidly reducing our emissions. The rule of thumb is we should be having our emissions in the next 7 years. And then we need to go to something like zero, or what they call net zero, by 2100. So we need to basically stop all emissions and then be removing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So if you're, again, this is just a very quick overview of some of the science. If you are interested in digging deeper into this, I recommend checking out the IPCC reports. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is a UN agency that produces what is generally considered the authoritative climate science. They summarize and share out kind of the state of knowledge on climate change. They do not employ their own climate scientists. They just convene hundreds of scientists from around the world to do this work. Recently, over the last couple of years, they've produced this thing called the Sixth Assessment Report, which is just an update on everything we know about climate change. So again, I recommend checking out the IPCC. So time for another check-in. Another
I
deep
got
breath.
the first one. Do you want to see the first one?
Oh yeah, I'd love to see the first one. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yes. So let me share that one because it's pretty interesting, the distribution. So this is the first one.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh yeah, lots of threes. Yeah, I see. Fairly evenly distributed. All right. Shall we try the second one and see where people are now?
I think so.
Yeah. And what I'll do is I'll continue with the talk, and then when you have the poll, you can just let me know and we can.
Perfect.
All right. Great. So yeah, folks, share again in the poll how you are feeling. I'm just curious. All right. It's good for you to check in as well. Meanwhile, let's move on, because there is another part to the truth, and that is the world of solutions. So let's spend a little time talking about solutions. Now, the way we think about solutions broadly in climate is along these three axes. The first is mitigation. Mitigation is actually just reducing our emissions, so stopping emitting greenhouse gases. The second is removal. Removal is sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. This picture shows a forest because trees, naturally remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but there's also several ways we can technologically remove carbon dioxide, not just from the atmosphere, but also from smokestacks. So there's a whole bunch of technological solutions for removal. And the last is adaptation, because like we know, we're already living through climate change and we need to adapt. This picture is from as you can imagine, a poor community. The houses are built on stilts. This is already a very simple adaptation technique for dealing with flooding. But there are many, many ways in which people are already adapting to climate change. And there's a lot of work that we need to do here. Now, there are these three axes, but because this is a short talk, I'm really going to focus only on the first one. And the key reason I'm only going to talk about mitigation is because there is no substitute for mitigation. If there is one lesson that you take away from this talk, it is this one, which is there is no substitute for reducing our emissions rapidly and getting to what we call zero or net zero. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Removal is not a substitute for mitigation. Adaptation is not a substitute for mitigation. If we are not reducing our emissions, removal is not going to save us. Adaptation is not going to save us. This is a very important lesson. And the reason for this is actually because carbon dioxide is a long-lived gas. Once you put it up, about 55% of it is removed, but by natural processes, but the rest of it just stays up in the atmosphere for a very long time. And so as long as we are emitting a single molecule of CO2, we are adding to warming. Okay, so even if we reduce the rate at which we are emitting year after year, So long as we are adding any carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, we are warming the planet. And warming will only stop when we get to zero or net zero emissions globally. So we will continue to warm the planet until we are at zero or net zero. And when we say net zero, what this effectively means is we still have to eliminate, we have to stop almost all emissions, and then about 10%, this very hard to abate sector, we can remove the rest. But it is very important to understand that if we slow down our rate of emissions, we might slow down the rate at which we are increasing warming, but we will continue to warm the planet. There is no substitute for going to zero or net zero emissions globally if we really want to solve climate change. Now, when we think about solutions, what's useful is to really look at where are these emissions coming from. This is a graph from our World in Data. This is actually a great resource, our World in Data. You might all be familiar with it already. That it just has a lot of great information, and you can download all the data. It's free access as well, so it's a good resource. So you can see that the vast bulk of our emissions come from energy. This is energy that's used in our buildings, in transport, in industry, and then agriculture, forestry, and land use change. That's also a very significant source of emissions. And then, of course, there's a couple of other categories here: industry and waste. This is when these all kind of add up, and these are all the main sources of emissions. And so when you think about where we really want to intervene, this tells you where we need to be putting in effort, all these different sectors, essentially. Though one thing that's important to know is we already have all the solutions, okay? When it comes to certainly the technological solutions, and even to a large extent now, policies, etc., we know what we need to be doing. Now, this was not necessarily true, say, 20 years ago, or even like, say, in the late 1990s. There wasn't really consensus, for example, on what might be the future for passenger transport. So some folks thought it might be hydrogen, and other folks were focused on biofuels, and others were focused on electric vehicles. And now we see that there is basically a consensus around electric vehicles. And so we have a lot more clarity. And for many, many of these solutions, they are very economically viable already. We're not going to have time to just dig into all of these solution areas, but there's a great resource by Project Drawdown that really lays out all of these solutions by sector extremely well. And you can zoom into any one of these, and then you can click on it, and you can just look at all of the different solution areas that exist within this one sector. And you can click on any one of these, and you can get information on the economics and on the climate impact, on how it works, what are challenges, etc. This is a great resource, and I recommend spending a little bit of time on Project Drawdown. So we have all the solutions. The main thing we need to do is really ramp it up. Like, we need to dramatically increase the pace of deployment, and we need to stop burning fossil fuels. That said, I do want to point out that solutions are not just about sectors, okay? There are different mental models for thinking about solutions. And while sectors are the dominant way in which we talk about it in the world of climate action, it's very, very important to call out that there are these cross-cutting levers that are also incredibly important. So things like politics and activism, obviously policies, law, regulation, finance, corporate sustainability, communications, education. These are cross-cutting levers, and they are very important, powerful tools at our disposal. Of course, they also operate within the sectors, but they can cut across sectors. One issue that I want to call out on its own, because it is so incredibly important, is climate justice. And if I had a whole other hour, I would just spend the whole hour talking about climate justice, because I think it is exceptionally important. In fact, I 100% believe that if we do not center justice, we are going to really struggle to fix climate change. In that, I think we will be undermining our capacity to fix this problem if justice is not at the center of this conversation. And I think this is not only true for the developing world, but it's also true globally as well, global north, etc. One other mental model that I find useful, and when I use this word mental model is just the way in which our brain makes sense of something that's very complex and figures out how all the different parts relate. This idea of multi-solving is a useful mental model. It's been developed by Elizabeth Savin, who runs something called the Multi-Solving Institute. And the idea behind multi-solving is that when we think about engaging in effective climate action, it's useful to focus on those interventions that provide multiple benefits at the same time. Now, I think this is especially important and true in developing countries. I grew up in India. In India, you can't be talking about climate action without also talking about development. There is a huge pressing need to solve poverty, inequality, just access to simple basic needs, electricity, water. The economy, needs to grow as well. And so if you want to have effective action, it is very useful to focus on those interventions that can also yield development benefits, that can create well-paying jobs, that can clean up the air, that can provide people access to basic services. So we spent a bunch of time on the truth part of the story. We focused on the problems and we also focused on the solutions. And now I'm going to get into this area of what I'm calling courageous action. And I'm borrowing this concept a little bit from the All We Can Save movement. It is both a movement and a book. It's also a resource and a kind of a set of principles and guidelines on how we can build new models of leadership in this time of climate change. They've separated courage and action, and I've just combined it into one idea because I find that more useful. So this idea of courageous action, and this is where we're going to get a little bit more tactical, and I'm hoping to provide some guidelines, just some pointers on how you can engage in meaningful climate action. So when folks ask me, okay, what can I personally do to solve climate change? If you look at the general world of answers that are out there to this question, they usually fall into two buckets. Okay, either the general answers are either they encourage people to focus on their consumer habits. So they say, well, one way in which you personally can make a difference is by being a conscious consumer. So being conscious about your purchasing choices. And if you have more money, doing things like putting solar on your roof or buying an electric car. The other way in which you can engage personally, the usual response is you can engage as a citizen. So if you live in a country where government is responsive to citizen pressure, you can engage in advocacy, you can engage in activism, you can help get the right kinds of leaders elected, you can you can engage in protest, you can engage as a citizen, you can try to influence policy at all levels of government. So you can engage as a citizen. But I would argue that there is a third very powerful resource that you have, and that is your career, your job. So whether you're a student right now and you're going to be moving into the workplace, or whether you're already in some kind of job, think about how much time of your life you are going to be spending in your career. How much of your creative attention is going to be in your career, in your job? How much of your mental capacity, how much of your community is going to be in your job? So this is an extremely powerful and important way in which you can have an influence on this problem. It is through doing the work in your career itself. So I want to spend a couple of minutes focusing on this idea. So climate change is basically remaking the global economy. This chart was actually pulled together by my co-founder and our CEO, Anshuman Bapna. So sorry, I don't have a source for all of these numbers, but it just shows what percent of global GDP are these big sectors, and all of these sectors are experiencing massive disruption because of what's going on due to climate change. So renewables is massively disrupting the whole energy sector. Many other things are as well. And so all of these sectors are undergoing massive transitions right now. And what this means is that there are a lot of new jobs, lots of new types of jobs being created, even as old types of jobs are disappearing. And, you know, this is not just something that I'm kind of saying off the top of my head. LinkedIn does this. They've been producing this study every year recently for the last few years. It's called the Global Green Skills Report. And they are finding that the entire economy, green economy, faces large talent bottlenecks. So the growth in demand for green skills is outpacing the increase in supply. So, you know, if you look at this, I've just taken this as a screenshot from their report. You know, from 2022 to 2023, the share of green talent in the workforce only increased about 12%, but it's like almost double of that number of job postings that require these skills. So this is a very important space in which we need some work. And honestly, this is why we created, myself and my co-founders, why we created Terra.do, the world's largest platform for upskilling talent into the green economy. Our goal is to get 100 million people working directly on solving climate change by 2030. And I know that CCAI also wants, you know, they have a similar mission. They want folks in data science to be working on this problem as well. And so we have, you know, we've been around for 3.5 years now, and we have developed over this time what we call our learning for action model. And I want to share this with you because I feel this is useful not only as a general framework for us as a company, but I think it is important for you to understand what the components of this are as you move forward, and pay attention to all three of these, because I think I'm very sure that all three of these are equally important as you engage in this work. So one obviously is knowledge acquisition and skills development, and that's why you're in this course. You're in this course because you're trying to learn things. But as you learn things and as you engage more in this work, you are going to become more anxious. Okay, this is hard work. We are facing something that is very existential. And so you need to build emotional resilience. This is a muscle, this is a capacity that we all need to build. And at Terra, we actually focus on this a lot. We think it is extremely important. It is as important as knowledge acquisition and skills development, and goes hand in hand, because you need this muscle in order to sustain you while you're doing this work, in order to not burn out. This is why we did those little check-ins. Those little check-ins were just a little taster of deeper work that we need to do, because the starting point for building emotional resilience is just awareness, like awareness of where you are in the moment. So that's why we did these check-ins, just as a little taster of what that might look like. And of course, the last thing is you need communities of practice. And that's, again, what you all are right here at CCAI. You are a community of practice, because this is very hard to do alone. And communities just provide a community of practice will provide so much value to you, help you find jobs, help you find your co-founders, just help you find friends. We have a similar community at Terra. You can sign on. It's free for you to join. You can participate in our events, etc. But I would argue that even these three are not enough. Even these three are not enough. Now, I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. And for that, I need to pull this graph up again. So remember when I said I'm not going to show any more graphs? Well, I lied, but you have seen this graph before. And the one thing I didn't tell you the last time I presented this graph was that about 10 to 15, maybe about 15 years ago now, the trajectory that we thought, that all the climate scientists and experts thought that we were headed on, looked like this, okay? I would say about 15 years ago, we all thought that we are headed to really catastrophic levels of warming. So more like 4 to 5 degrees C. Okay, this is where all the projections, if you look at the old IPCC reports, they had us on this kind of a trajectory of emissions. And the reality is that we have already bent this curve. Okay, we have bent this curve. Obviously not far enough, but all of this effort has had some effect, all the effort that we've undertaken already. And I would say that actually what's driven the bending of this curve is courage. Okay, it's taken courage. It's taken people in government, people in corporations, people in universities, people in communities, doing something that's hard, stepping out of their comfort zone and pushing their organizations, pushing from inside, pushing from outside, taking courageous action. And that is what has bent this curve. So of course, what we need is a whole lot more courageous action, because we still have work to do here. So I want to take a last couple of minutes just to talk a little bit about, so if you like what you like what you've heard in this talk and you want to dig deeper, you want to learn more about the science, you want to learn more about the solutions, at Terra we have a bootcamp, this Learning for Action bootcamp. It is a global online climate bootcamp for professionals, where we do get students as well. We welcome students to join us as well. This is really focused on helping people find that sweet spot of intersection between your skills, the opportunities that are out there, and maximum climate impact. So helping you identify that and just launching you into climate work. And so again, if you're interested, just check out our website, terra.do, or you can join our community. We run open houses about this course every 6 weeks or so. So one more check-in, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to see actually if we have results from the last poll. Also check on time.
Yes, we have plenty of time. Let me show you briefly. Awesome. I think we closed up this poll very quickly, but you can see real big shift. And it was just, oh my goodness, that's a very interesting.
So can we do one more now?
Of course.
And see where folks are at, one last one.
Of
and
course.
Meanwhile, I'll just wrap up the talk and we could switch to Q&A.
Of course.
Let me share my screen. So yeah, one last time, Ollie's going to share a poll. How are you feeling? Close your eyes and check in for a moment. All right. Okay. And now I'm going to end, and I am going to leave you with a prompt. I am going to leave you with a prompt. Okay. The year is 2045, and we have solved this problem. We have solved climate change. And you are one of the many heroes of this great transition. And your story was inspiring to millions. Now, by this point, Terra.do is this huge, massive platform, and we have invited you to share your story. We've invited you to share your story. So think about, what is one courageous act that will be part of your story? What is one courageous act that will be part of your story? Go beyond your comfort zone, face one difficult truth about yourself, your organization, your sector. This shouldn't be something you've done before, but something you will do. Use your imagination and think of courageous people you admire and their stories. So that's all I have. I wanted to allow enough time for Q&A, so I'm going to stop sharing. I'll see if we have poll results.
Do we have poll results, Amanda? Not yet. People are in the chat.
All right.
We can start a round of questions. Yeah.
Sure.
So the figure talks about CO2 emission that increases significantly. How about the portion of CO2 in the air? So this is a specific question. And whether it increases similarly. So the distinction, I guess, is...
Oh, well, okay. So for this, you need to understand the global carbon cycle. Okay, so the global carbon cycle, not all of our emissions stay permanent, stay in the atmosphere. And so about 55% is removed by natural processes. So this is the ocean absorbs a huge chunk of our emissions. And in fact, we are putting so much extra CO2 into the ocean that we have changed the pH of the ocean. Okay, we're making it more acidic. And this is one of the big threats to coral reefs as well, because reefs do not do well in acidic environments. Outside of just, they don't do well with increased temperatures either. so oceans absorb like a huge chunk of it, and then plants absorb carbon dioxide too, and so we can see a little bit of a fertilization effect because of CO2, like especially in the northern atmosphere, we're getting a little bit more plant growth, although this is questionable because climate change is also driving drought and wildfires. So it's kind of complicated to say that overall there's a net fertilization effect, but trees absorb carbon dioxide, plants absorb carbon dioxide. So there are like about 55% of what we put out is removed from the atmosphere by these natural processes. And they've been adjusting as we've been increasing. So the ocean takes in more and more dynamically as we put more and more in. Although even this is like a dynamic process and there's going to be some limit to it. So the remaining 45% that's up in the atmosphere, it can have an extremely long lifetime, like it can last thousands of years in the atmosphere. So it's kind of slowly removed, very slowly removed from the atmosphere. Rock weathering also removes a little bit of CO2, which is a very slow geological process. And so that remaining percent stays in the atmosphere for a very long time, and it kind of like very, very slowly decreases over time. And so, so that is the stuff that's directly contributing to warming. The stuff that's left in the atmosphere adds what we call like radiative forcing, essentially. And so, but there's a pretty like direct relationship between emissions and like concentrations. Therefore, like if you just account for this, you can, it's a very simple calculation. Honestly, you can do this calculation yourself. There's a simple way to just go from emissions to concentrations. And every year our concentrations continue to go up. So even though the pace at which we are emitting is slowing down, like you saw even that graph, like it's kind of like slowing down. We are still warming the planet because, like I said, this CO2 lives for a long time in the atmosphere, and so the part that remains, and this adds to warming. Every molecule of CO2 adds to warming.
It has a follow-up question of where and who will be most impacted as a result of climate change and how we can support them, which is a great question.
It's a really important and good question. And I'll answer this in a slightly convoluted way. So, obviously, people with fewer resources, so like folks in vulnerable communities around the world, and these are generally folks who live more in poverty, may not have like a lot of income, have experienced like racial, economic injustice. They are poor farmers around the world. Like when I show that picture of the Great Climate Migration, like when folks can't grow their own food, they're not just going to lie down and die. They're going to pick up and move, but they are in distress. I mean, they are going to have to find a way to adapt. So that's definitely one group. But I will say that one should also not underestimate like capacity for resilience and a lot of this capacity. So like quite early in my career, I was working for this company called Selco. And what we did at Selco was rural electrification with solar PV in communities that lacked access to grid electricity. So we worked in India, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. And I spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka, like a few years in Sri Lanka. And at that time, there was a civil war in Sri Lanka, and we were still trying to build this solar business, like essentially doing rural electrification. And the one thing I learned is like, even in the context of civil war, like there's an incredible amount of community resilience, like, and it actually comes from community. And in fact, I would say that in some ways, like these highly like overbuilt systems we live in the US are almost more vulnerable because when folks like honestly, like they were living in a small hut that's not that hard to like rebuild. Like when I think about the kind of infrastructure we have, say in California, and I've learned recently that, and it was in the news that not only one, but two big insurance companies in the US have stopped providing home insurance in California. Okay, so now Allstate and State Farm will not sell you home insurance in California. And this is partly because we actually State Farm especially pulled out directly because of wildfires and the risk that wildfires are posing, and the fact that when these disasters hit, they hit on such a large scale, it really affects the insurance company. Like they have to do like hundreds, thousands of payouts, and they don't have the capital. And so they're not providing home insurance. And I'm thinking, well, if you can't buy home insurance in the United States, like what's going to happen to like the entire economy? Like the huge part of the economy is based on this like home sales, and and then there's a similar conversation going around insurance in Florida, like because of sea level rise and flooding and that risk, and hurricanes as well. Like, so once insurance is no longer available, like what does that mean for entire millions and millions of people in this country? Now, so that's a little bit of a roundabout answer. So I just want to make the point that we may think, oh, because we're better off, whatever, we're going to deal better. But I don't think that's necessarily true, first of all. Secondly, I think, and I've seen this, is that when something bad happens, having a very strong community, because all weather events, like all disasters, are experienced locally. Okay, they are experienced locally. And the first responders are always local. And so you just having a very responsive system, having a very strong local community where neighbors are looking out for each other, where folks are like connected. This is also extremely important component for like being able to recover and come out of disasters. But obviously we want to be proactive, right? We don't want to have people undergo these disasters themselves. And so that's this entire world of adaptation. And adaptation is very, very locally context specific. So what kind of adaptation measures you might undertake in Mumbai might look very different from, say, New York City, even for the same kind of risk, because it's very context specific. It's resource constrained as well. There's this huge emerging world of like global climate finance, and there's a lot of, I would say, struggle and a deep amount of unhappiness from, rightly, I would say, from developing countries on how little developed countries are like willing to contribute to this big fund that they want to set up. But the goal of this fund is going to be, the goal of the fund is to finance a lot of adaptation interventions in the developing world. So it's very hard to answer this question, like in terms of what can we do to help. I would say actually just start with where you are at and look around you and figure out like, hey, what's going on directly around me, like where I live in my community or even in my state, like where are folks vulnerable? And, can I get involved with some kind of organization that's working with them? Can I work with city government? Because often it's hard to access government, but at least if you are in the United States or Europe, city government is a place where you might have a little bit more access or influence, or you might be able to support in some way. Cities are the place where adaptation, like it's kind of ground zero for adaptation again, because these problems are experienced locally. So you might want to think about, can I work with city government? Can I work for a nonprofit or a volunteer organization? There are huge organizations like the Red Cross that depend on volunteers. Can I become a volunteer firefighter if I live in a place where there's fires? So again, look at your context, look at what's going on around you, understand what the climate impacts might be where you are, understand where the vulnerable communities are, where you might have some access, and then you can make a call on this.
Great answer. Last question in the last 2 minutes, and I show you the final poll just for your interest. So regarding climate change attribution studies, I'm aware that we can estimate the effect of anthropogenic warming by comparing CMIP historical simulations, CMIP simulations with no anthropogenic emissions. Are there other methods for attributing extreme weather events or similar to human activities?
So this is a great question. So the only one that I know of is this one, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but there is this scientist named Dr. Frederick Otto, OTTO, and she's written a whole book on this topic. And I would say she's kind of like defining the field. She's one of the key people behind that website that I shared. And so I recommend, I think her book is called like The Angry Weather, or so it's a very new book, so it should be pretty up to date. Her last name again is OTTO, and I've been meaning to read this book myself. My understanding of the again, I am not a climate scientist, so my understanding is exactly what you described, which is these running the models with and without anthropogenic forcing, and so it's like a probability based kind of modeling, and the other important thing I want to say is that it really depends on the different kinds of disasters. And so certain things we are able to say with much more certainty, and others it's still kind of a real evolving space. So for example, heat waves, we're able to like say things with more certainty in terms of like, what are the chances, to what extent did climate change make this event more likely? But there's other things, for example, Atlantic hurricanes, or even cyclones, partly because like when you have events that are rare and you don't have a record that goes back very far, it becomes very hard to say for sure, oh, this particular event was, with any certainty was made more likely by X%. So there's certain types of events where this is kind of still an evolving, like really evolving field, and it's harder to do these attribution studies. Now, the reason these attribution studies are so important, okay, there's many reasons, but I would say one key area that is very interesting that I've been watching is this space of climate lawsuits, okay? So in every country around the world, now there are thousands of lawsuits around this world, and there's actually an entire database that tries to track all of these. Even in the US, there is a group of children. Okay, there's this case brought by these children against, I think right now, the state of Montana. And so like basically saying you are not safeguarding our future. And this is where these attribution studies become very important, because you're trying to find a party to blame. And so for example, after Hurricane Katrina, I believe there was a lawsuit trying to hold some oil and gas companies accountable. The state of Hawaii is suing some oil and gas companies, I think, as well. And so you need to be able to say, like, you want the science to be able to attribute your particular experiences to climate change in order to be able to say, okay, now, we know this is caused by climate change, and we know that you have contributed X% to climate change. So this is one area of application for these attribution studies that's very important. And actually, Amanda might know more than me because she works in this. She's a lawyer, but she's got a law degree. But it's there's like lots of other reasons for doing these attribution studies. For example, like all of the climate risk assessment work that essentially every organization now, certainly financial organizations, are trying to undertake. And there's a lot of data science stuff going on in this space as well, like because large, EU regulation and soon probably US regulation is requiring large financial institutions to quantify this risk. And so they have to figure out, there's two types of risk broadly, right? Like physical climate risks, like literally like how will climate change directly physically affect your assets? And then there's a thing called transition risk. So as the economy transitions into, say, clean energy, if you are left with stranded assets, so you actually have financed all these coal plants and now suddenly there's no need for them, that's called a transition risk. And so there's a lot of work around trying to quantify these risks, and these attribution studies are important there as well. So I'll stop there, but I think this is a great question. I'm sorry, but I do recommend that book, and I'm going to check it out myself.
Okay, I'll post it later. Kamal, thank you so much for an excellent lecture. I'll show you briefly the poll that has gone again back a little bit more.
A little bit back.
But
that's good. I didn't want to leave people like really down.
No, it's great. No, it's great. So we're going to take a pause of 2 minutes. Thanks again, Kamal.
Thank you.
We will go back into to the lectures.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah. And thank you for the great work you're all doing. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, folks. Let's go for the last one. So, it's a pleasure to present the last lecture of today's day, and is the Introduction to Machine Learning by our own Rasika Balarao. She's an assistant teaching professor at Northeastern University Kuberi College of Computer Science in San Francisco Bay. She holds a PhD from NYU Tendon, and she is currently serving as vice chair of the communications committee here at Climate Change AI. This is her. And please, Rasika, take it away. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. All right, and of course, please let me know if it's not sharing correctly. Sounds good. All right. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Rasika. I'll be talking about an introduction to machine learning. So here's our overview of our agenda. First, I'll just introduce machine learning, and then we'll talk about three main types of machine learning. So that's supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. And then we'll have some examples at the end. So, first, you might have heard of machine learning a lot. I'm going to assume that there's a wide variety of backgrounds here. If you want to kind of define it with just one sentence, Andrew very succinctly put it like this: the science of getting computers to act without explicitly being programmed. This is kind of different from just regular coding without machine learning, where you have to explicitly tell it, when you see this, you do this, when that kind of thing. Here, the computer will learn based on data that we give it. And so, as I briefly mentioned before, there are three main types of learning. The first one, and most common one, is supervised learning. And that is where the computer learns to predict or classify labels based on labeled data that we gave to it before. Right, so basically just copy the same pattern that you saw in the input data, copy that in the future. Then the second type of learning is unsupervised learning. And so this one is not labeled. The data is not labeled. And so the computer just finds patterns that it can use later on without being explicitly trained which patterns to copy. And then the third one was reinforcement learning. And this one has been gaining popularity recently. So basically this is where the computer learns well-performing behavior from observing the observation and from the state, and then also the rewards that that it receives from the environment. So and this one is the reinforcement learning is not limited by the labels or anything that we can give to it. So that's why it's so powerful and been gaining popularity recently, is because it can do better than labels that we gave to it with supervised learning. So to tell the difference between the first two, supervised versus unsupervised learning, here's an example. I've got some fruits, 2 apples, one's green, one's red, and then 2 bananas, one's green and one's yellow. And so with supervised learning, we would tell the computer, this one's an apple, that one is an apple, this is a banana, and that's a banana, right? We would tell it that, and then in the future, when the computer sees an apple, it'll know that it's an apple, right? That's supervised learning, where we train it to know exactly what to do. With unsupervised learning, this is, so the same data, right? 2 apples, 2 bananas, but we don't label it, right? We just, the computer learns that, oh, these two apples are similar and these two bananas are similar. Or maybe it learns that this picture is red, the middle two are green, and the last one is yellow, right? It learns kind of patterns about what these things have in common. And that's all, right? It learns about the patterns in the underlying patterns in the data. There are also some different data types that you might use, and you will definitely use when if you continue on with the summer school here. So these are very common data types. One is just continuous, right? Continuous numbers. This is most numbers that you might think of. And then discrete is not continuous, right? So it could be numbers, but it could also be just like categories, or anything that isn't continuous. Go back. And then of course there's categorical, which is actually labeled categories, for like, for example, they might be names rather than numbers, right? So there's not really an order to the categories. Then there are two other kind of special cases of categorical. One is binary. So that's where there's only two categories. And then there's ordinal, where the categories are ordered. So there's an example or two examples here. The how do you feel today, right? We had a similar poll to that earlier today. So yeah, how do you feel today, right? Like these are categories, but there's a bit of an order to them. Or you might have filled out a form like the one on the right before, where you ask, how satisfied are you with our service? And then you have to say something between 1 and 5. And, there's an order, but the numbers aren't particularly, it's the order that matters. Okay. So the data types that you might use, here, let me just open this, in climate change data, right? A very popular type of data is tabular data, where it's what it sounds like. It's in a table, right? Each item is a row in a table, and the columns are the features. But then there's also other types of data that you might not think of at first when you think of what types of data you'll be using. So that would be like time series, right? Where the time or just the order of the data is an important part of the data. It's an important part of the input. There's also graph or network data. And so you've seen these before, right? For example, the social media friends graph, or just, within social media, just the tweets and retweets, right? Where each item is a node in the graph, and then there's edges between them. And then, other types of data, images, often this is represented with each pixel is 3 continuous features, right? A number for the red, a number for green, and a number for blue. So you can represent images as 3 numbers per pixel. And then, of course, very popular recently, language or text, where each word is a categorical feature, right? So basically any word from the dictionary, or whichever set of possible words you're using, each word will be one category from that set of words, basically. So these are really common types of data that you might use when you're doing climate change stuff. So that was a very brief introduction to machine learning. We will now go into supervised learning and talk about some types and some issues that come up with it. So overview of how supervised learning works. You start with some training data like this, right? So for example, this is some example data set, it's not real, where you have 4 people named cat, elephant, dog, and turtle, and each one has an age, a location, and whether or not they are a customer labeled. Right, so you have some data like this, and then you want to train a supervised learning, a model based on this. So right? So once we have that data, we collected our data, we use that training data to build a model. And that model might look like this, right? Where the model says, if their age is less than 9, then yes, they are a customer. And if their age is greater than or equal to 9, then no, they are not a customer, right? So you might learn a model that just takes all of the other features and then predicts the one that you said was the label, right? That's what a model might look like. Once you have built that model, right? Here's our model, just copied from the previous slide. Then you can use it in 2 different ways. One is to evaluate that model, right? You want to actually see how good of a model it is on data that it has not seen before. So you have your test data set, basically, that looks very similar to your training set, but it's just, items that were not in your training set. So, but they are formatted the same. And then you see how well your model performs on this test data. Right, so penguin and snake, these were 2 customers, or people, I guess, that were not there in the training data. And then we see how well the model predicts whether or not they are a customer, right? And so it looks like it works pretty well on this test data set, right? When the age is less than 9, then yes, age is greater than 9, no. Both of the items in the test data fit that, the model performs accurately on these. So the model performs well on this test data set. And then the other way that you might use your model is on unseen real world data. And so this is where you get a new person and you don't know if they're going to be a customer or not, right? Like maybe you're deciding whether to approach them to be a customer. So you get their age, and then you look at your model and you say, based on this model, would this person probably be a customer? And then, your model will say yes or no. And then, yeah, you're using your model on unseen real world data to use it in the real world. Okay, so the 2 ways that you might use your model. Okay, so with supervised learning, right, the model that we just learned was basically like, is the age greater than or equal to a certain number, and then yes or no, right? The yes and no were the 2 categories that that you could have as your output. So generally, with supervised learning, there's 2 types of supervised learning algorithms. One is with categorical labels, right? So the example that we just had was categorical, right? Yes or no, 2 categories. Other examples would be a model that's predicting whether or not someone is pregnant, right? Like a pregnancy test, or which country they are from, right? All the countries will be categories, and then that, or like which type of road sign is it in this picture? Those are all categorical labels. And so you would do classifying for those. And then the other type is with continuous labels. So for example, predicting the future stock price, right? That is a continuous thing to predict, or life expectancy, or distance to an obstacle in a picture. Right, these are things where you want to predict a continuous number. So you'll use different algorithms for that. So this is kind of usually whenever I'm introducing a classifier, this is what I use as the example. So let's say that you have a training set like this, right? Where there are some rows in your data. There are 4 rows in your training set. And you've extracted 2 features for each thing, X1 and X2. And so you can see those 4 rows and you can see them plotted on this graph, right? And so, 2 of them are red, 2 of them are blue. And then now we have a new instance. That's that outline of a circle at 6, 6. That's our unseen instance. intuitively, by looking at this picture, you would think it should be blue, right? Because it's way closer to the blue dots than it is to the red dots. So that's kind of, it's taking the closest things to it in the training set, and then whichever one those things are, whichever color those things that are close to it are, it's taking that category. So that's called the k nearest neighbors algorithm. That is the algorithm that we just talked about. So basically, for the test data, you check the k instances in the training data that are closest to your new instance, right? So you pick a k, and then you say, okay, if k is 4, then you say, okay, out of the 4 closest things in the training set, like what are they? Then that's the category that you'll use here. If your output label is categorical, then you'll choose the majority label as the label that you're using. And then if they're continuous, then you can choose the mean or the median of those values, right? Depending on what works best with your data, you can choose how you want to kind of get the average of those values, whichever algorithm you want to use. So this is the simplest kind of k nearest neighbors algorithm. Yeah. So another algorithm that you might see, it's kind of the very popular one, at least very popular, linear regression. And so basically this is to predict a continuous output, right? So where you have x, which is any real number, and y, which is also any real number, we want to find a linear function that takes us from x to y, right? So the input is x and the output is y. And so, right, so we're just finding a line that tells us how to get from x to y. And the way we define this line is it's the line that has the smallest mean squared error between the prediction, right? So what we said the line would be, and the ground truth, which is what the data actually is, right? So basically you find the line that is as close to the middle of all of the dots as possible. So this picture on the right is an example of that, where we had some data, those are the blue dots, and then we calculated the red line by being the line that is the smallest squared error between the dot and the line. And so, right, that's for if it's a line. If it's not a line, it might be a polynomial, right? Or it could be some other function. And luckily, this is actually the same problem underneath, right? Because instead of just having it be a linear function of x, it's some other function of x, and the beta values here in this equation are things that you're solving for, and then so it looks very similar to a linear function. It's just that you raise your actual data to some exponents, which luckily you already know your data, so this will become a linear problem, basically. Right, so it turns into the same process as a linear regression, as long as you already know the value of the exponent that you are raising your data to. So it looks like this picture on the right, where instead of a line, now it is this polynomial with degree 3, and but otherwise the line goes through the dots just like it did before. So, and I notice how I mentioned, like, as long as you know the value of d, right, then the value of the degree of the polynomial, you have to know what shape your data takes, basically. So that brings me to the next question, which is, what if you don't know the value of d, right? What if you don't know the degree of your polynomial in advance? So often we, kind of check how good our model is by, the squared error, right? Like the same thing that we did to actually calculate the line. That's how we know how good the model is, right? Like if the distance between the ground truth and the predicted value is very small, then it's doing well, right? So we calculate that sum of squared error, And we can see how well it does for different values of D, right? So based on, like, if we assume that the degree of the polynomial is 1, then our squared error is going to be like 650 something, right? That's what this graph says. And then if the degree of the polynomial is 2, then the error will be a little bit lower, but still, you know, like 475 or something. And then if the degree of the polynomial is 3, then our error will be a little bit less than 100. So that is a lot better. And then degrees 4 onwards, you know, they do decrease the error, right? They are a little bit better, but not a lot. But, you know, so yeah, looks like the best kind of bang for your buck is with degree 3, according to this graph here. So I would fit a polynomial of degree 3 on the data that we have trained this on. Of course, as I just mentioned, right, we're choosing degree 3, even though degree 10 has a smaller sum squared error, right? And so that's what this question is asking here. What's the problem with choosing degree that has the lowest squared error? You know, that would be because the degree with the lowest squared error is going to be the largest degree possible, which is you know, the size of your data set. That's going to have the smallest squared error because everything will be exactly perfectly predicted and your model will be 100% accurate on your training set. That will be the lowest squared error. And that degree is terrible because it'll be a very squiggly line and you know, it's going to take a long time to calculate and everything. So, you know, that's not the ideal. So we don't want to choose the degree with the lowest squared error. Instead, we want the one that performs reasonably well, but still is, you know, pretty small degree. So what I just mentioned, right, where it's a very squiggly line and every single data point is perfectly predicted in your training set, that's called overfitting. So you know, we've got 3 graphs here. Let's look at the graphs on the bottom first, where excuse me, the orange dots are the data that we're trying to fit, and the blue line is the model that we are training, right? And we're trying to make the model fit the data. So on the left, we've got underfitting because, you know, the data does look a little bit curved, but we just put a line there. And so that's, you know, that's not really a high enough degree to fit the data well. So that's underfitting. Then in the middle, we've got just right? That curve looks like it follows the curve of the data. And then, you know, yes, not all of the data is exactly on the line, but generally it looks like that it fits the data. And then on the right, we've got overfitting, which is what I was talking about, like a really squiggly line. And right, you're trying to fit as many of the little dots as possible, but you know, if you look at it, it looks a little silly, right? Like, I don't really think that's how the data should, you know, that's not the right model, right? Unless we have a really complex model underneath, that's probably not the right model, right? Most models are not supposed to be that complicated. So that's overfitting.
Rasika,
So, yeah.
I have a very quick question if you're
Sure.
taking questions at this point in time.
Yes, please.
Yes, so there is a question of how is distance determined for categorical values to help determine what's near, what it's near. Since, you know, distances are very well defined for continuous variables, how would you do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, and so just to kind of summarize, like so far, yes, I've been talking about distance in terms of like continuous outputs. For categorical, there's a few like basically just like different measures that we use. When we are training the model, we often use like the probability of it being that category, right? And so that's a number that you can kind of have it be like close in probability. And then also you can also just test whether or not it got the category correct, right? So like 1 if it got it correct and 0 if it didn't. And that's often for testing how good your model is after you've already trained it. So yes, that's a very good question. These kind of examples that I'm showing here are for continuous outputs. Yes. Yep. Yeah, I'm glad that question came through. Please continue asking more questions. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so yes, with continuous values here, right, that is overfitting, that one on the right. This one is overfitting. It's way too squiggly and probably more complex of a model than the actual data warrants. Then, so, you know, how do you know if you're overfitting? That's this graph on the top up here, right? So as you're training your model, you will get this blue line that's called like the training accuracy, right? So as your model gets more and more complex, your accuracy will get better and better, right? It'll, you know, more complex, the training accuracy will get better. You'll go through more of your training data points. Yes, but your testing accuracy will increase at first until it's the right level. And then your testing accuracy will go down again as the model gets more complex than than it should be. And, it doesn't generalize well to test data. So that's the yellow line is the testing accuracy. And we want a model that will do well on the actual real world data, right? So the test set, that's what we want, right? We want the top of the yellow line. So the idea is that we want to find like how the model does on unseen data. And so a really popular solution to overfitting is cross-validation. So basically your training data that you were training your model on, split it into 2 sets. And one of them is your actual training set. And then the other kind of set aside part of the training set will be a validation set. Excuse me. And so basically you train it on your training set, just like usual. And then you test how well the model does on your validation set to decide whether or not your training set needs to train more and become more complex or not. Right. And so this is still not your actual test set. So, right, you don't want to look at your test set before actually testing. That's cheating. But it is a validation set. So it is, you're not training the model on it. You're just checking how well the model that you're currently training does on some test, right? You're just checking how well it does without actually training on that data. And so, that's called cross-validation. We use it often to avoid overfitting. Right, by just checking how well the model does on data you haven't seen, how well the model hasn't seen, really. Cool. So yep, that's overfitting. Make sure not to do overfitting. Right, so yes, that was a good question before, right? All the stuff we've talked about, well, the pictures that we looked at were from continuous labels. And so if we're doing categorical labels, then that's called classification. And so a really popular classifier uses logistic regression, right? And so, for example, here is some data here on the left, right, where we have like what we know, the X value is like the average score, basically. And then the thing we're trying to predict, the category, is whether or not it got accepted, right? So like some, 0 or 1, yes, it got accepted, or no, it didn't get accepted. And right, this is going to not do well with a linear regression, right? Like you can kind of look at it and see that a line will not go through this data well, right? Because there's a bunch of dots all in the same place for each of these, right? And they're all stacked on top of each other, and it's not in a line. So a line is just not going to fit this data well. And even if we said, okay, make it the probability of accepting, right? So since it's a bunch of data numbers stacked on top of each other, we can check what percentage of them were accepted. That is a probability. And so that becomes the graph on the right, where it's the probability, like the percentage that were accepted. That's the plot. Even if we do this, still not great for a linear regression, because, well, linear lines go from negative infinity to positive infinity, and this is not going to infinity. So, so we do need something like different for categorical outputs. And so the, popular solution here for logistic regression is to map the probability, right? So first the probabilities were from 0 to 1. You map it into the range from negative infinity to positive infinity, so that it becomes something that you can fit with a line, right? So take the thing from range 0, 1 into negative infinity, positive infinity, and then now you can do your regression like before. So that's a really popular classifier, right? Because even though, yes, it's using continuous values, those values then can be translated back into probabilities, which you can use for your category output. So that was a very popular classifier. There are other supervised classifiers that are very popular. So I'm just going to list a few of them here. Definitely not going to go into detail on all of them, but there are resources that you can, that are linked that you can use to. So one is decision trees, right? And so that looks a lot like this, right? So here is a model that is a decision tree, determining whether a word is at the end of a sentence, right? So we have some text, we got the word, and we want to know if the word is ending a sentence or if you should continue reading the next word because that was not the end of the sentence, right? So we're trying to decide whether it is. So the first thing we ask is, are there lots of blank lines after this word? If yes, then it is the end of the sentence. If not, then it's not, right? Then you check the punctuation afterwards. And two questions about the punctuation, and then last of it is whether or not it's an abbreviation, right? Because if it's an abbreviation, then the period probably was not for ending a sentence, but maybe it was for something else. So, right, we just have a series of questions that we use to determine whether or not the word is the end of a sentence, right? And so learning this tree is something that we can do with, a machine learning algorithm. And this tree is called a decision tree. Very useful. I recommend looking into them. They perform well. Then there are also support vector machines, which look very similar to logistic regression. They are just more geometrically motivated. So, right, where logistic regression would find a line that kind of best separates the zeros from the ones, basically. Support vector machines also does that, but it finds a line that, geometrically fits, separates it better. So out of these three lines, red, green, and black, linear regression might find either the green one or the black one. But support vector machines would find the red one because it most neatly separates the orange and the blue with like a lot of extra space on each side. And so that's kind of a support vector machine, is that it separates things with the most space. And it also has a really nice motivation that doesn't have to be a line separating it. It can have other shapes as well. And so I recommend looking into it if you want to separate your categories with something other than a line. Then of course there was naive Bayes, which I don't have a picture for, but that's just another way to kind of just use probabilities to determine the category of something. And then the last one is of course a neural network, very popular. As you can see from this picture, it involves a bit more computation. So, go back one slide. A lot more computation. So, more compute, more complexity, right? That takes more time and resources. But also it can perform very well, as you've seen in the news, right? So here we have our input features, X1, X2, X3. We have a bunch of computation here in the middle. And then on the right, we have two output values, Y1 and Y2. And so, right, just another way to go from X to Y.
Ristika, I have another question from the public is, are there a minimum number of data points required for linear regression to be reliable? Basically, how large a data set is considered sufficiently large for linear regression to be successful?
Oh, that's a really good question.
No.
It's
It's like power analysis. You.
Yeah, like excuse me. That's a really good question. Mostly because I don't have like one solid number for you. Generally, I would recommend looking at your data. If it looks like a line, then it might be something worth trying. It's actually, I would recommend doing it like if you have a lot of data, then well, if it's way too much data, then maybe go back to linear regression, because that's a little more computationally, like saves more energy. But otherwise, if you have a lot of data, but it's not like a giant amount of data, other models could also do well, right? That might perform a little bit better. Maybe it's not exactly linear, right? But you can actually tell that complexity with a more complex model. Yeah, there's, I guess at least 2 would be the number if you want like a concrete number for the size. That's a really good question. And of course, all the other people on this call, please feel free to jump in with like examples you've seen where there's like this was too small of a data set for linear regression. Yeah. Yeah, linear regression works really well. Honestly, like I've tried it with a bunch of stuff with like more complex models in other places, and then I tried linear regression. It turns out that did way better anyways than a complex model, right? So like I think it does well in a lot of places that may not be determined only based on the size of the data. Yeah. But yeah, please, that's different experiences will say different things too. But one thing that I think a lot of us will agree on is that you don't want to re-implement these algorithms yourself, right? Like I've talked about like learning this tree and learning the linear function. Do not re-implement it yourself. So unless you're like doing research on the method itself, or you're just trying to learn how it works, or you're coding in an obscure language where it isn't already implemented, the already implemented versions are widely used and tested, and like they are being maintained. So definitely use the existing implementations. And then, of course, also here are some links to common tools. Scikit-learn has it's open source, and it has a lot of unsupervised and supervised methods that you might need. And then if you want to build your own model, then PyTorch and TensorFlow, all good places. And then there are also a lot of task-specific libraries as well. I'm sure that they will introduce those as they come up in the rest of this summer school. So I'm just going to quickly move on. Right, we've been talking a lot about supervised learning, and then yeah, that life tip applies to everything. So unsupervised learning, right, as I was mentioning, is where you learn kind of patterns in unlabeled data, right? So for example, learning clusters, right, or groups in the data. So the examples up here on the right, these are just like Google News, basically. This is a screenshot of Google News, and they have automatically clustered news articles by category, right? So that's clustered. They've clustered these news articles by category. Some other places, right? So finding clusters. Other places that people use clustering algorithms would be for customer segmentation, right? So you want to find what sort of groups of customers do you have? Or maybe finding user accounts that are all suspiciously similar. Maybe they're all the same person. Maybe grouping your search results, like the picture up here on the right. So, and then, you know, there's a lot of other kind of applications of clustering algorithms. But, you know, a common question is like, what other types of unsupervised learning are there? There are some. So, for example, topic modeling, right? So if you have a bunch of text and you want to know what is being talked about in that text, maybe you can, you know, it's like find the topics in a group of documents, basically. Or a lot of times people use unsupervised learning to figure out what are the important features that they can then use for supervised learning. Right, so the input features that they use for supervised learning, that is something to decide. And so you can use unsupervised learning to decide that. And similarly, right, you can learn vector representations for words and documents, right? So instead of just selecting important features, this would be actually learning some like representation that is not just a subset of the features, but is a new feature for each word or document. And then of course, language modeling, right? Just like how the popular language models, they just read in a bunch of text that was not labeled, and now they can do a bunch of stuff with it. So yeah, there's a lot of unsupervised learning out there, but the most popular is clustering, of course. And then yes, text rank, which is like part of text summarization. That's not labeled, but it still kind of ranks words based on how important they are for documents. So clustering, right? You don't have labels. So the data looks very similar to the training set of a training, you know, the training set, but there's no label. So there's just the, you know, the item and then its extracted features. And then you find natural groupings in the data. So that same data on the left, you know, let's say you graph it, you've got feature 1, feature 2 here on the right, and then you plot it. The clustering algorithm should hopefully detect that there's a group that looks similar here, a group that looks similar here, and a group that looks similar there, right? So this is not labeled data, it's finding patterns. And of course, right, this is something that there's not one correct answer for. So, right, that's why the same data, as you can see here, may have different clusters. So, you know, you can see here on the bottom left, it's 2 clusters, or on the top right, it's 6 different clusters, right? Just based on how you define your clustering algorithm, it'll find different clusters based on that, because there's not just one correct answer when it comes to this. There are 2 types of clustering algorithms. One is just flat clustering algorithm. So that means you start with a random clustering and then you make it slightly better, slightly better, slightly better until it's good, right? And then that's your clustering. Otherwise, there's also hierarchical clustering, which basically it turns your data into a tree like this. So the things that are closer together in the tree are closer together in real life. And then the more joins you have to go through in order to get to the other item, the further apart those 2 things are. So that's hierarchical clustering. And there will be some pictures in a few slides as well. K-means is from the first category. It's the flat clustering algorithm. Usually people use k-means as a baseline, as I've seen, right? So just like some example of how, like, everyone knows k-means, basically they assume. And so if you want to know how well k-means does, then that's how it does. And then here's our wonderful other clustering algorithm, right? So they use it as a baseline. K-means clustering is basically exactly what it says, right? Oh, you start with a random, you know, assign each item into a cluster, and then you readjust the center of the cluster to be the mean of the point. So it's basically randomly assign it first, and then keep making it slightly better, slightly better, slightly better until the clusters are reflect the data well. So here's an example, right? We start out with this data like this. We randomly pick 3 cluster centers like this, blue, red, and pink. And then we assign each data point to its closest center. And then we update the centers to be the mean, the average of the things that are its data points. And then you update the data points. And then you update the centers. And then you update the data points. And then you update the centers. And then you update the data points. And finally, when they stop changing, right, that means that this is as good as the clustering is going to be. And then those are your clusters from your k-means clustering algorithm. A really major problem with k-means clustering is that it does not perform well with outliers, right? So here's a picture of it not performing well with outliers. Let's say this was our data like this, right? We've got a bunch of dots down here and then 3 dots here. And we said we have 4 clusters. Well, each of these dots is going to take up a whole cluster. And then, oh, go back. Each of these dots is going to take up a whole cluster. And then, then our actual data down here, which is not outliers, kind of just all gets assigned to one cluster. This is not ideal, as you can see, right? We didn't actually detect the actual clusters down here. So yeah, outliers are going to just, give you the wrong clusters when you use a k-means clustering algorithm. So, which brings us to kind of hierarchical clustering, right? The other type of clustering, where it turns your clusters into a tree, right? So here's some data on the right, and then there are circles drawn based on how close the data is to each other. And then that same clustering is reflected in this tree on the left. So like, for example, 1 and 3 are very close together. So 1 and 3 are in the same little tree down here, right? And then the further apart that 2 data points are, the more joins you have to go through to connect those 2 data points in the tree. So that's hierarchical clustering. I'm going to go a little bit faster just to kind of get through the lecture time. Yeah. So yeah, and then, in scikit-learn, there's a bunch of clustering algorithms that you can get through. So I recommend looking at them. The last type of learning that we're talking about today, the third type, is reinforcement learning. And that's where the agent learns from its environment, right? So not labeled data, but rather learns from the rewards that it got from the environment. So here's an agent that's learning and it's interacting by performing actions in the environment. And then the environment gives it back a reward and a new state that is the result of the action that it took. So for example, the game of Pac-Man, right? You're training the Pac-Man, this is Ms. Pac-Man, I think. And then you can define it that the reward is 1 if the Pac-Man eats a pill. Then the reward is -10 if you get caught by a ghost, right? So you define some rewards like this, and then the algorithm will train it to eat the most pills and not get caught by ghosts. When you're doing reinforcement learning, a kind of key concept is that you want to balance exploration versus exploitation. And so basically, like exploitation is where you take good actions based on what you already know works, right? You exploit the knowledge that you already have. Whereas exploration is you actually take a chance on actions that you may not actually know that they perform well yet, but you take a chance on them because maybe you actually learn that they are good in the long run or something like that, right? So you explore the options. And a key concept in reinforcement learning is balancing the two. So you start out by exploring a lot, and then as you learn what performs well, then you exploit that by using that path more often. Here's an example very, very quickly. Right, so here's the lizard game. There's a lizard here. That's the agent that you're trying to learn. Lizard wants to eat as many crickets as possible, right? So 5 would be ideal. 1 is okay, I guess. And then the bird is bad. The bird will eat the lizard. So you want to get the lizard to the crickets, right? And so you can define your rewards based on like how many crickets it got and how it avoid the bird. And so you can see how you'd want to balance exploration and exploitation, right? Because if you somehow learned that there's a cricket up here and you didn't learn about the 5 crickets down here, then when you're exploiting your knowledge that you already know, you'll just keep going up to the 1 cricket and you'll never explore and learn that there's 5 crickets over there. And so that's why you got to explore everything first. And then after you know where where is the best reward, then you can start to exploit that knowledge a little more by little. Right. And so, yeah, if we only did exploitation, it might get stuck going only up to the 1 cricket. So, right, very quickly, those were the 3 types of learning: supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. I'm just going to quickly talk about 2 examples that have come in as papers to CCAI's workshops recently. So, right, the links to those papers that people have submitted to the workshops they're here. This is the first of the 2 examples. And the example is predicting bicycle counts, right? So basically, you're given, the data set is historical data of the number of bicycles in certain locations per hour. Oh, thanks for publishing the poll. It's available in the circle. So yeah, so you're given the historical data of how many bicycles there were in each location per hour. And then going forward, you want to predict how many bicycles there will be in future times at those locations, right? And this is actually someone's paper. This is a real data set. Yeah, so there's a poll out there for the best option, right? Should we use linear regression? Should we do overfitting? Should we do clustering? And should we do reinforcement learning? So let's see, the poll was published about like a little under a minute ago. So I will give you a few more seconds.
We seem to be having some issues with the permissions.
Oh, okay.
Permissions. But yes, meanwhile, I can throw you a couple of questions that I have seen from the public. So how to choose the best data analysis method. And for example, in a case of a binary on a binary target, there's a lot of choices. And what would you choose? Logistic regression, super vector machines, decision trees, and what would be best?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sorry, just to clarify your first question, like how to choose the right data? Like, do you mean like binary
data analysis method? So what I think basically is like which algorithm would work better.
Oh, okay. Yeah, of course, I can see that, a lot of different people will have different answers for this. Yeah, I always recommend first understand your data really well. Like, so there's like exploratory data analysis basically first, like understand, the numbers are very lopsided here, right? We have a lot more positive than negative or something, understand the distribution of your data, what sort of outliers you have, where are all the errors in your data collection that you might want to avoid, right? Understand your data really well. And then based on that, then you can choose the right algorithm. So for example, if you have like a lot of I don't know, a lot of categorical data, just like a large, huge amount of categorical data, then naive Bayes might actually work best just because it's a lot quicker for large amounts of data, like requires less storage, right? Yeah, otherwise I could try a lot of things. I've seen like with decision trees, people often use like a bunch of decision trees in what's called a forest, like a random forest. Those perform really well as long as you avoid overfitting, basically. Yeah, so depending on your data, but please, others feel free to jump in too when you chose the right data.
Yeah, I also do via performance. So what performs better? Which algorithm kind of fits better the task in terms of performance? That I also would add. Another question, which it labels itself as a dumb question, which I think there's no dumb questions in climate change, right? No. So, but how do you determine how useful your unsupervised clustering was, or how well it worked? And how do you decide between flat and hierarchical? That's a great question, in my opinion.
Yeah, that is a really good question. And that's actually something that we definitely we didn't get time, but that was something that I thought might be good to include, is evaluating your clusters. And so there are some numerical ways you can evaluate your cluster, like how close together are your clusters, and then within each cluster, and then how far apart are they from other clusters, right? That's a thing you can calculate. But yeah, I guess other than those kind of just straight a number, it's also just with unsupervised learning, how much information did it give you, right? That's did it give you the patterns you were looking for, would probably be the thing to measure. And then in terms of choosing flat versus hierarchical, there's a few instances where only one will work. For example, if you only know the distance between items, but you don't actually have the items themselves, then you're going to need it to be a hierarchical clustering, right? So for example, if your rows are text or something like that, if you actually plotted that on a giant several 100,000 dimensional data space, that would not be good. So instead you might just only measure kind of the distance between the text, how many words are different, how many characters are different, and you only know the distance between them. And so then that would be, you would have to use a hierarchical clustering algorithm, because that is based on distance between things rather than the actual items themselves. But other than if you have some data that'll work on either case, then yeah, whichever one gives you the information you're looking for, and which one performs best, right? If you find out that there's a lot of outliers, then maybe the hierarchical will work a lot better anyways. Yeah. Sorry, you're muted, Olivia.
Yes, one more question, and perhaps there's an issue with the permissions of the polls.
Okay.
So one more question, and then maybe you can arrange those, and then when we can post it. Oh no, it's out there. Oh, it's great. Oh, fantastic. Okay. It's fixed. So guys, the polls are open.
Okay.
But I'm just gonna include let's go first with the polls, and then I ask you more questions. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Great.
So they just opened. Then I'll give them 10 seconds to click the answer here.
So again, for the public, predicting bicycle counts. So given that historical data of the number of bicycles in certain locations per hour, you want to predict the number of bicycles in future times at those locations. What is, in your opinion, the best option? Go ahead. Again, no dumb questions. This is all about learning.
We don't know who answered what. So you can answer whichever one yeah. We're not going to come back and be why did you say this was the answer? I'm going to go to the next one just in the interest of time, the answer in the interest of time. Linear regression is the best option out of these. There are other models that would work best, but linear regression out of these is the correct answer. Not overfitting, definitely avoid overfitting as much as possible. It's not clustering because you do have labeled data, and it's not reinforcement learning because you have labeled data. The next example, which I'm not sure if we have time to do the poll on this one, but that was just climate policy documents, right? So your data set is just a bunch of climate policy documents. And this is also a real paper. Yeah, so you want to know just what is in these documents. You want to understand the vague general categories in these documents. Yeah, so, okay. Yeah. So for this one, I'm just, in the interest of time, we got less than a minute left. Clustering would help you to understand the vague general categories here. But oh, I see. So yeah, there are other ways, you know, like if you have another way of using the data for another type of model, that's wonderful. Yeah. So but what worked best here was clustering. Just a quick note before we finish on GPT, because I know that's a really popular thing. GPT is a machine learning model that predicts the next word. Right, so the input is a sequence of words or just the start of sequence token, and then the output is the next word, right? That's the model that it does this. As mentioned before, right, there are a lot of drawbacks to this model, right? It's just predicting the next word based on what it's seen on the internet. So that's, you know, that's going to make it, you know, do a bunch of stuff like hallucinate facts. They have shown this in their own report that it can hallucinate facts. It can also reproduce the social bias that it learned from the internet that it is trained on. Otherwise, here are the key takeaways. Yeah, 3 types of learning, 2 types of data, and where you can find the code. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rasika. Are you still up for a couple more last questions? And then we can call it a day? All
Yeah,
right.
sure.
So reinforcement learning needs a huge volumes of data and a lot of computation. This consumes a lot of energy because of repeated reinforcement. For AI applications in climate change, where data is to be analyzed in real time for alerts and forecasts, is reinforcement learning a good approach to follow? This is a great question.
That is a good question, and I am not the expert on that. But I would say that, like, I mean, depending on like how many, like, there are some models that you only train them once, and then after that, like, using the model is less expensive, right? So depending on how much time it takes to train versus how many times you use it and how much compute it takes to use it, you know, that could be taken into account for like the actual emissions caused by the model. But yeah, anyone feel free to jump in on this or ask the people in that lecture in a few weeks.
I think so we're going to touch base on that, but I think Lynn made an amazing point this morning. There are code packages available to be able to track those carbon footprints meanwhile you're coding. And I would encourage people to start using them if they want to keep on doing this sort of training. Last question. Thank you, Rasika, for your patience.
Yeah.
When we talk about language modeling, generally we're talking about self-supervised learning. Is there a reason to use unsupervised learning in language modeling?
No, so yeah, what I meant was self-supervised, like it learns to predict the next word. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So there is not a reason for why not using unsupervised learning. Okay.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, you can use unsupervised learning in other ways for text, but
yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Rasika, thank you so much for an amazing introduction to climate change. It was super interesting. It made me learn a few things again. So that was pretty great. And thank you all for coming through and, you know, registering, making super interesting questions. I would largely encourage you to keep on looking at the community platform where we do have feedback forums happening. And those, the count in for actually getting a certificate of completion for Climate Change AI summer school. So I would largely encourage you. Other than that, the day is over. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.